A Banff hiker was found days later with no memory of the trail. When the heavy beam of a commercial transport truck cut through the freezing fog along a desolate stretch of Highway 1, it was just past 3 in the morning. The driver had not seen another vehicle for over 40 miles. The surrounding forests of the Canadian Rockies were swallowed by absolute pitch black, pressing in tightly against the narrow ribbon of asphalt. As the truck rounded a sweeping curve, the headlights washed over a lone figure standing precariously close to the white shoulder line. The driver instinctively hit the brakes, the heavy tires hissing against the damp road. The figure was not waving for help. He was a man, standing perfectly rigid, facing the dense and impenetrable tree line rather than the highway. He was shivering violently in a heavy canvas winter coat that was easily 3 sizes too large for his frame. The truck driver, gripped by a sudden and inexplicable sense of dread, did not open his cabin door. Instead, he locked it, rolled his window down just a fraction of an inch, and called the authorities. When the provincial police arrived 20 minutes later, they recognized the shivering man almost immediately from a high-priority missing persons bulletin issued 4 days earlier. He was the experienced mountaineer who had vanished without a trace from a remote alpine trail in Banff National Park, over 130 miles away. But when the officers wrapped a thick blanket around his shoulders and gently asked for his name, the man simply stared through them. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely hollow as he whispered that he was still in the woods. According to the official search and rescue logs, the 32-year-old man had embarked on a carefully planned 3-day solo trek near the rugged Sawback Range. He was not an amateur. He was a seasoned outdoorsman who carried a satellite emergency beacon, detailed topographical maps protected in waterproof casing, and enough high-calorie provisions to comfortably last a week. His detailed itinerary was filed with park rangers, outlining a precise route that followed well-worn valleys and challenging alpine passes. For the first 48 hours of his journey, everything appeared entirely normal. Then, without warning, his satellite beacon ceased transmitting. It did not send a distress signal. The digital ping simply vanished from the monitoring grid at exactly 11:15 p.m. When a specialized search and rescue team finally reached his last known coordinates 2 days later, the scene they discovered left them deeply unsettled. His isolated camp was perfectly intact. His heavy, weatherproof tent was securely pitched beneath a canopy of old-growth pines. His 0-degree sleeping bag was neatly unrolled, and a small, portable camp stove sat cold next to a carefully constructed fire pit. Most disturbing of all were his heavy, mud-caked hiking boots. They were sitting neatly side by side just inside the zippered tent flap. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no aggressive animal tracks, and no scattered gear to indicate panic. The undisturbed scene suggested a deeply unnatural narrative. It looked as though the man had calmly unzipped his tent in the middle of the freezing night, stood up in his thick woolen socks, and walked purposefully out into the sprawling, silent wilderness. Finding the missing hiker alive should have been a moment of profound relief for the rescue teams, but the physical condition in which he was discovered only caused the mystery to deepen into something much darker. The sheer distance between his abandoned campsite and the icy stretch of highway where he was found spanned roughly 130 miles of unforgiving terrain. It was a brutal landscape of jagged, unnamed peaks, deep ravines, and freezing, fast-moving rivers. It was a journey that would have taken a fully equipped, highly trained expedition team over a week to traverse on foot. Yet, the man had seemingly covered that impossible distance in under 4 days. More baffling and deeply disturbing were the bottoms of his feet. Despite leaving his protective boots at the campsite, his bare soles were entirely pristine. There were no deep lacerations from the sharp scree fields, no pine needles embedded in his skin, and no signs of severe frostbite from the freezing alpine temperatures. He had allegedly walked over 100 miles through the harsh Canadian wilderness without shoes, yet his feet looked as though he had been resting indoors. Furthermore, the oversized, stained winter coat he was found wearing bore a faded embroidered logo from a regional logging company. According to public records, that specific logging company had filed for bankruptcy and ceased all operations in 1998. The hiker possessed absolutely no memory of where he acquired the heavy coat, how he crossed the impassable mountain ranges, or why he had abandoned his own shelter. Medical professionals at the regional hospital noted that his physical vitals were bizarrely, almost impossibly stable. He was not suffering from severe dehydration, and his core body temperature and blood sugar levels were entirely within normal limits, heavily suggesting he had eaten and rested recently. But his mind was trapped behind a thick, impenetrable wall of fog. When attending physicians gently pushed him to recount any detail from the last 4 days, his resting heart rate would immediately spike to dangerous erratic levels. He would squeeze his eyes shut, dig his fingernails into the rigid plastic edges of his hospital bed, and describe an overwhelming sensation of heavy pressure, comparing it to the feeling of being trapped at the lightless bottom of a deep lake. He told attending psychiatrists that the last normal event he could vividly remember was sitting by his unlit campfire around 8 o'clock in the evening, listening to the bitter wind move through the high pine branches. Then, according to his fractured, halting recollections, the wind completely died. He claimed that the natural ambient sounds of the forest, the chirping insects, the rustling underbrush, the distant rush of glacial water, all ceased at the exact same moment. In their place came a low, continuous, vibrating hum that seemed to echo from beneath the soil, a sound so deep it made his teeth ache and his vision blur. Hoping to construct a timeline of his movements, investigators retrieved the man's digital camera from the side pocket of his discarded backpack at the campsite. They transported the memory card to a lab, hoping the photographs might provide a rational explanation for his sudden disappearance. The first 30 pictures on the card were entirely unremarkable, showcasing sprawling, sunlit mountain vistas, gray rock faces, and clear blue skies typical of a Banff hiking trip. But the final series of images, captured on the night he vanished, defied any logical explanation. There were exactly 14 photographs taken in rapid, frantic succession at 2:14 in the morning. At first glance, the images were mostly pitch black, violently out of focus, and marred by strange, thick digital artifacts. But as photo analysts slowly adjusted the exposure and contrast levels in a darkened lab, vague, deeply unsettling shapes began to emerge from the digital noise. The massive pine trees in the background appeared heavily distorted, as if the thick wooden trunks were bending at impossible, unnatural angles toward the lens of the camera. In the final 3 photographs, the dense, suffocating canopy of pine needles overhead was faintly illuminated by an unnatural pale gray light that cast no shadows. The distinct, reflective outline of the hiker's tent was nowhere to be seen in any of the frames. Digital metadata extracted from the files indicated that these final photos were captured deep within a valley nearly 20 miles away from where the physical camera was actually found. The hiker remained in a secure psychiatric ward under close medical observation for over 2 weeks. During that extended period, his missing memories did not naturally return, but highly specific, disturbing behavioral tics began to surface. Night shift nurses reported in their charts that the man would wake from a dead sleep at exactly 2:14 in the morning every single night, without fail. He would immediately pull his knees tightly to his chest, press the palms of his hands fiercely over his ears, and stare blankly at the acoustic ceiling tiles. When a night orderly once cautiously approached and asked him what was wrong, the man did not look away from the ceiling. He merely whispered that the trees outside the window were too quiet, and that the sky behind the clouds was the wrong color. During his daily therapy sessions, he claimed that during his lost days, he had walked through a sprawling, ancient forest where the shadows cast by the trees did not match the position of the sun. He spoke in a monotone voice about a hidden valley that did not exist on any topographical map, a place where the jagged rocks felt strangely warm to the bare touch, and the stagnant air smelled heavily of ozone and burning copper. He adamantly insisted that he had not walked the 130 miles to the highway. Instead, he claimed the dark woods had simply shifted and rotated around him, rearranging their geography in an endless maze until they finally spat him out onto the cold asphalt. The most deeply unsettling revelation came during a routine cognitive mapping test in his third week of observation. A specialist asked the man to draw a simple map of his planned route on a large sheet of paper, hoping the physical, repetitive act of tracing his steps might unlock a suppressed memory fragment. The hiker calmly took the black pen and began to sketch the Sawback Range with surprising, practiced accuracy. He drew the winding trail, the river crossings, and the exact location of his final campsite. But as his pen reached the perimeter of the camp, his hand began to tremble violently. He drew a tight, jagged, aggressive circle around the campsite. He pressed the ballpoint pen down so hard that the thick paper tore, furiously filling the circle with dense, chaotic scribbles of black ink until the pen ran dry. When the specialist carefully asked him what the dark void represented, the man stopped drawing entirely. His breathing grew terribly shallow. He looked up, his eyes hollow, exhausted, and filled with a profound terror, and stated softly that it was the place where the geography finally ran out. He told her that on that night, he had walked a few yards into the trees to investigate a strange, metallic sound, but when he turned around to go back to the safety of his tent, the trail was simply gone. It was not hidden by brush or darkness, it was completely erased from the earth. He said he kept walking in a straight line for what felt like years, but the massive tree trunks merely repeated themselves, forming an endless, looping corridor of identical bark and dead silence, trapped beneath a flat sky that held absolutely no stars. To this day, the bizarre case remains officially classified by the authorities as a severe incident of temporary dissociative amnesia, likely brought on by exposure to the elements or an acute psychological break. The investigative file was quietly closed, with officials concluding that the man must have somehow hitched a ride on a private logging road to cover the impossible physical distance, despite the glaring fact that no driver ever came forward and his feet bore no signs of travel. The hiker never returned to the Canadian Rockies. According to distant relatives, he relocated to a flat, arid desert region in the American Southwest, choosing a home miles away from any large trees or heavy foliage. But the veteran park rangers who patrol the deep, isolated valleys of Banff still whisper about the abandoned campsite near the Sawback Range. They say that on certain still, moonless nights, the natural, comforting sounds of the alpine woods simply drop away without warning, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating, and unnatural silence. And those who intimately know the persistent legend of the lost hiker know better than to step off the marked trail in the dark, driven by a quiet, lingering fear that the ancient trees might quietly close in behind them, leading them into a silent space where time, distance, and memory simply cease to exist. A Banff trail case where time did not match the distance. When search and rescue volunteers finally located David near the lower bend of the Banff Ridge Trail, the immediate confusion was not that he was injured, but that he was entirely unrecognizable. He had been missing for exactly 48 hours. Yet, as the lead tracker approached the slumped figure resting against a decaying cedar tree, he noted that the man possessed a thick, untrimmed beard and fingernails that had grown long, yellowed, and brittle. His hiking boots, purchased brand new just 3 days prior, according to his wife, were worn down to the smooth, treadless rubber. The leather of the boots was cracked and bleached by an impossible amount of sun. He sat only 2 miles from the main parking lot, staring vacantly into the dense, damp ferns. The incident occurred in October of 1998 in a remote, fog-heavy stretch of the Cascade Mountains. David was 34 years old, an experienced outdoorsman who closely followed local elevation shifts and weather patterns. He had planned a simple 6-mile loop up the ridge and back down through the valley. It was a Saturday. He left a detailed itinerary on his kitchen counter, stating he would be home by 6 o'clock in the evening. When darkness fell and his vehicle remained the only one left in the gravel lot at the trailhead, the local Forest Service was notified. By Sunday morning, a standard grid search had commenced. The weather was unusually mild for late autumn. There was no rain, no sudden drop in temperature, and no wind to disturb the forest floor. Search dogs were brought in to trace his scent from the driver's side door of his car to the wooden trailhead marker. They followed the invisible path easily for the first mile, their noses pressed to the damp earth. But near an area locals called the Silent Basin, a natural depression surrounded by towering, moss-draped Douglas firs, the dogs stopped. They did not bark, and they did not whine. They simply sat down on the trail, refusing to cross an invisible threshold, their focus locked on the empty woods ahead. The human searchers pressed on, leaving the animals behind and moving through the basin in a sweeping line. The silence in that specific section of the forest was profound. Several volunteers later reported a strange heavy pressure in their ears, similar to the sensation of descending rapidly in an airplane. The natural sounds of the woods, the rustling of leaves, the calls of distant birds, and the rushing of nearby creeks simply ceased to exist. It was in this pocket of dead air that they found the first strange piece of evidence. It was a single boot print pressed deep into a patch of soft mud. The tread pattern matched the new boots David had been wearing. However, the stride length was entirely wrong. The distance between the right footprint and the next left footprint was nearly 9 feet. It was a distance impossible for a man to cover in a single walking step, suggesting he had been running at a dead sprint or perhaps leaping in blind terror. More disturbing to the trackers was the direction. The footprints did not lead deeper into the woods, nor did they lead back toward the trail. They turned abruptly and led straight into a dense wall of thorny underbrush where no path existed. Following the projected path of those leaping strides, a volunteer found a discarded plastic water bottle resting upright on a flat stone. It belonged to David. It was completely empty, bone dry on the inside, without a single drop of condensation. The clear plastic had yellowed significantly and turned brittle to the touch, exactly as if it had been sitting in the relentless heat of a desert sun for several years. When the volunteer picked it up, the plastic cracked audibly beneath the light pressure of his fingers. The search was suspended at nightfall and resumed early Monday morning. The atmosphere on the mountain had shifted overnight. A thick, clinging mist rolled through the pine trees, limiting visibility to less than 50 feet. At approximately 9:15 a.m., a Forest Service dispatcher monitoring the emergency radio channels caught a brief, heavily distorted transmission. It was not broadcast on the standard civilian band, nor was it intercepted on a ham radio frequency. It came through on a secured tactical channel used exclusively by park rangers and emergency personnel. The voice breaking through the heavy static was weak, parched, and trembling. It was later positively identified as David by his wife, though the tone was undeniably altered. He did not ask for help. He did not provide his coordinates or describe his injuries. Instead, the dispatcher listened as the man muttered in a low, exhausted, almost hypnotic monotone. He stated clearly that the sun had not come up. He repeated this exact phrase 3 times. He then whispered that he had been walking down the same slope for weeks, but the trees were only getting taller and the path beneath his feet was turning to gray ash. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp, mechanical click. Tracking the signal proved impossible. The radio tower logs showed no origin point for the broadcast, no triangulation data, and no registered radio ID. It was as if the audio had simply manifested directly out of the speakers in the dispatch room. Meanwhile, the ground teams were circling back toward the lower bend of the trail, sweeping an area they had already thoroughly checked the day before. The mist was particularly thick near the base of the ridge. It was here, just 20 yards off the marked path, that a volunteer noticed a dark shape huddled against the massive roots of a dead tree. David did not react when his name was called. His eyes were open, but he did not blink. The pupils were dilated to the very edge of his irises, rendering his eyes completely black against the pale whites. The paramedics who arrived on the scene documented an array of physical impossibilities. He was severely malnourished, his collarbones and ribcage visible beneath the torn remnants of his wool sweater. His skin was leathered, deeply tanned, and heavily weathered. The internal zipper of his jacket, made of stainless steel, had rusted completely shut. But the most disturbing detail was the digital watch strapped securely to his left wrist. The glass face of the watch was scratched and clouded with thick condensation. The digital readout was still functioning, powered by a specialized, long-lasting battery. When the lead medic checked the screen to log the official time of recovery, he found that the watch displayed a date in the middle of October in the year 2005. The internal calendar of the device had advanced exactly 7 years over the course of 48 hours. The stopwatch function, which David frequently used to time his hikes, was still running. It showed over 61,000 hours logged. They carried him out of the woods on a rigid backboard. He offered no resistance, his limbs limp and unresponsive. The medics estimated he weighed no more than 110 pounds, a staggering loss from his documented weight of 180. At the local hospital, the attending physicians were baffled by his preliminary blood work. His body showed the advanced stages of prolonged starvation and severe vitamin deficiencies, conditions that typically take many months, if not years, to develop. The soles of his feet provided further grim evidence. When the nurses removed the remnants of his wool socks, they found the skin covered in thick, hardened calluses. The heels were split and bleeding, with layers of dead tissue built up in a manner consistent with someone who had walked barefoot across rough terrain for thousands of miles. Yet, despite these signs of immense physical decay over an agonizingly long period, an examination of his digestive tract revealed the partially digested remains of the oat granola bar he had been seen eating in his car on Saturday morning. Biological time and chronological time had violently separated within his own body. Investigators attempted to piece together the missing 2 days by examining his personal belongings. His day pack, constructed of heavy-duty, weather-resistant nylon, was frayed at every seam. The bright red fabric was bleached almost white, heavily stained with a pale gray dust that did not match the soil composition of the Cascade Mountains. Deep inside the main compartment, wrapped inside a brittle plastic bag, they found his 35mm camera. The film roll was carefully extracted in a darkroom and sent to a specialized laboratory for development. There were 24 exposures on the roll. The first 3 photographs were perfectly normal. They depicted the gravel parking lot, the wooden trailhead marker, and a shot of the morning mist rolling through the lower valley. The lighting was consistent with an overcast Saturday morning. The 4th photograph, however, showed the edge of the silent basin, and the lighting was deeply unnatural. The shadows cast by the dense fir trees fell in conflicting directions, crisscrossing over the trail, suggesting multiple dim light sources in the sky, none of them directly overhead. From the 5th frame onward, the images documented a landscape that no park ranger, surveyor, or local historian could identify. The trees in the photographs were dead and entirely stripped of bark. Their trunks were smooth, twisting upward like blackened, broken fingers against a pale, featureless sky. The ground was covered in a thick layer of the same gray ash found on his backpack. There was no underbrush, no rocks, and no trail markers. Just an endless, repeating expanse of dead timber and gray dust. The photographs grew increasingly erratic as the roll progressed. Frames 15 through 20 were heavily blurred, taken in motion. The camera was pointed downward or angled wildly at the sky, suggesting the photographer was running in absolute panic. The lighting in these middle frames grew progressively darker, the featureless sky fading into a deep, impenetrable black. The final photograph on the roll, the 24th frame, remains the most debated and heavily classified piece of evidence in the entire case file. It was severely underexposed, dominated by absolute darkness. But near the center of the frame, caught in a grainy, out-of-focus blur, was a towering structure. It appeared to be a massive stone staircase carved directly into the side of an impossibly sheer cliff face. Standing on the lower steps of this staircase were tall, vaguely human silhouettes. They were elongated and impossibly thin, their limbs disproportionate to their bodies. Their featureless heads were turned entirely toward the camera lens. The only illumination in the photograph was a dim, sickly red glow radiating from the top of the stairs, casting long, unnatural shadows down the steps. David never regained the ability to speak. He spent his remaining weeks in a secure, private room in a state medical ward. He spent his days sitting rigidly in a chair, staring blankly out the window at the distant tree line of the surrounding hills. He refused to sleep in the dark. He became violently agitated, screaming soundlessly if the nurses attempted to turn off the overhead fluorescent lights. Whenever the room darkened, even momentarily from a passing cloud, he would scramble backward, press his spine against the farthest wall, and cover his eyes with his bruised, trembling hands. His physical deterioration accelerated at a terrifying, unnatural rate. Within a single month, his untrimmed hair and beard turned entirely stark white. His teeth loosened and fell out. His bone density collapsed, leaving him fragile and bedridden. Medical specialists were flown in from out of state, but they could only diagnose his condition as an incredibly aggressive, entirely unprecedented form of rapid cellular aging. He was aging years in a matter of days. He passed away quietly in his sleep on a Tuesday evening in late November, exactly 6 weeks after he was found near the trail. The official death certificate filed by the county coroner listed the primary cause of death as complete heart failure brought on by severe environmental exposure and clinical dehydration. No mention of the advanced cellular decay, the mismatched timeline, or the impossible state of his equipment was included in the public medical record. The investigative case file was quietly closed. The anomalies were officially written off in internal memos as severe delirium combined with manufacturing defects in his gear. His digital watch was placed in a sealed evidence locker in the basement of the regional precinct, its scratched screen still glowing, silently counting the thousands of impossible hours. The camera, the brittle water bottle, and the envelope of developed photographs were archived deep within the state's missing persons database, filed under an obscure case number, rarely requested and never published for the public to see. But among the tight-knit community of search and rescue teams who still work the Banff Ridge Trail, the story of David remains a quiet, persistent warning. The veteran trackers of the unit will never hike through the silent basin alone, regardless of the weather. They advise newcomers to always keep a close eye on their own shadows, ensuring they only ever point in one single direction. And if the surrounding forest ever grows completely, entirely silent, if the birds stop calling and the wind dies down to nothing, they are told to turn around immediately and walk back to the parking lot. They are warned to leave before the path beneath their feet begins to stretch, before the trees start to grow unnaturally tall, and before the time required to walk home becomes longer than the years they have left to live. A British Columbia forest report was filed and then removed. The digital log appeared on the regional supervisor's terminal at 3:14 a.m., tagged with a priority code that had not been used in the British Columbia Provincial Forestry Network in over 20 years. The supervisor, a man who had spent 3 decades monitoring the vast, unmapped expanses of the coastal wilderness, sat forward in his chair. The night shift in the Victoria Dispatch Office was usually quiet, punctuated only by the occasional automated weather update or a routine check-in from a logging crew. But this was different. The flashing alert on his screen indicated a code-red environmental anomaly. It had been submitted by a senior timber cruiser stationed deep in a remote, protected sector of the Great Bear Rainforest, more than 200 miles from the nearest paved road. The supervisor clicked to open the file. The surveyor had uploaded a text document containing 3 short paragraphs and a single, low-resolution audio attachment. The text did not describe a wildfire, an aggressive grizzly bear, or a poaching camp. Instead, the seasoned surveyor described an area of old-growth cedar where the topography had seemingly folded in on itself overnight. He wrote that the tree trunks in a 2-mile radius had turned entirely white, drained of all color and moisture, and that the ambient air pressure was fluctuating so violently it had cracked the glass face of his analog compass. The final sentence of the text report simply read, "They are emitting a low, continuous mechanical hum." Before the supervisor could click the play button on the audio file, his screen flashed a sudden flat gray. The terminal froze for a fraction of a second, the cooling fan humming loudly in the empty office. When the system refreshed and the network connection stabilized, the inbox was completely empty. The glowing red priority alert was gone. The submission log, which recorded every piece of incoming data down to the microsecond, showed no entry for that hour. The report had not just been deleted or moved to a spam folder. According to the architecture of the provincial server, the file had never existed. The supervisor immediately picked up his desk phone and called the overnight information technology department. He woke a technician who remotely accessed the regional router to run a diagnostic trace. The technician sounded confused as he reported his findings. He confirmed that a data packet of significant size had indeed pinged the primary receiver at exactly 3:14 a.m., but the origin node was now returning a fatal error. Someone, or something, had executed a hard scrub of the network. Furthermore, the GPS coordinates attached to the surveyor's transmission were now blocked out on the digital map. The sector, a dense valley previously mapped and surveyed dozens of times, was now registered in the database as a blank, unassigned zone. By 6 o'clock in the morning, a quiet panic had begun to set in among the upper management of the forestry department. The surveyor was a veteran of the woods, a man who spent months alone in the deep bush and was known for his grounded, pragmatic nature. He was not prone to exaggeration, and he certainly did not possess the technical capability to hack a secure government database to erase his own reports. The department authorized a private helicopter charter to fly over the coordinates at first light, bypassing the official search and rescue channels to avoid drawing unwanted attention to the missing data. The pilot reached the airspace above the valley at 8:30 a.m. The weather across the coast was clear, with bright morning sunlight illuminating the endless sea of green pine and cedar. But as the helicopter banked over the specific coordinates, the pilot radioed back to dispatch with a hesitant voice. A perfectly circular column of thick gray fog was rising from the valley floor, obscuring the canopy entirely. The fog was not drifting with the wind. It remained entirely stationary, rising like a solid pillar. The pilot noted that as he passed within 1 mile of the fog bank, his instrument panel began to flicker, and a loud, rhythmic static washed out his communication relay. He was ordered to return to base immediately. A small, specialized ground crew was assembled 48 hours later. They were briefed only that a surveyor had missed his scheduled satellite check-in and that equipment failure was suspected. The team drove for 6 hours up deteriorating logging routes, finally abandoning their trucks when the mud became too deep. They hiked for another 2 days through the dense, wet undergrowth of the rainforest. The expedition leader later noted in his personal journal that the transition into the surveyor's sector was not gradual. It happened over the course of a single step. One moment, the team was walking through a vibrant, noisy ecosystem filled with the sounds of dripping water, rustling leaves, and calling birds. The next moment, they crossed an invisible threshold into absolute, suffocating silence. The air grew instantly cold, and the smell of damp earth was replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of ozone. The forest floor here was covered in a fine, pale dust that resembled ash, though there were no signs of a fire. As they pushed deeper into the valley, they saw the trees. Just as the deleted report had described, the towering ancient cedars had been stripped of their bark and color. The wood was bone white, smooth to the touch, and strangely warm. The branches were completely bare, reaching up into a canopy that was shrouded in the unnatural stationary fog. The ground team moved slowly, their unease growing with every silent step. There was no wind, yet the white trees seemed to vibrate slightly, transferring a deep, sub-audible tremor through the soles of the searchers' boots. They found the surveyor's camp just before dusk. The heavy canvas tent was fully erected and entirely untouched. His camp stove, climbing gear, and emergency rations were neatly organized on a folding table. The site showed no signs of a struggle, no animal tracks, and no indication of a hasty departure. However, when the expedition leader unzipped the tent to look inside, he found the surveyor's heavy winter jacket laid perfectly flat on the sleeping bag. The jacket was completely dehydrated. The synthetic fabric crumbled into brittle flakes when the leader tried to pick it up, as if all moisture had been instantly baked out of it in a vacuum. Sitting beside the crumbled jacket was the surveyor's physical logbook. It was a heavy, leather-bound ledger required by the province for legal record-keeping. The leader opened it, hoping to find a written copy of the deleted digital report. The first 40 pages were filled with mundane daily notes, weather observations, and soil acidity measurements. But the pages covering the final 3 days of his deployment had been removed. They were not torn out in a rush. They had been excised with surgical precision, sliced perfectly down the binding so that barely a paper fiber remained. The only electronic device left in the camp was a secondary handheld GPS unit resting on a stump outside the tent. The search team gathered around it as the technician powered the screen on. The battery was somehow fully charged. It took a moment to acquire a satellite lock. When the numbers finally populated on the display, the team stared at the screen in silence. According to the uncorrupted hardware, their current elevation was not 4,000 feet above sea level, where they should have been. The device registered their elevation as a negative number, insisting they were currently standing 3 miles beneath the surface of the Earth. The expedition leader ordered an immediate retreat. The team hiked through the night, using headlamps to navigate the maze of bleached, vibrating trees, desperate to reach the tree line where the normal forest resumed. They left the camp exactly as they found it, taking only the corrupted GPS unit and the altered logbook. They spoke very little on the long drive back to civilization, each man privately haunted by the sheer, unnatural wrongness of the dead valley. When the team submitted their findings to the regional office, the response was swift and bureaucratic. The photographs they took of the white trees were confiscated and classified under a vague Environmental Protection Act. The anomalous GPS unit was sent to a federal laboratory in Ottawa and never returned. The surveyor was officially declared lost in the woods, his disappearance attributed to a tragic, unverified fall into a fast-moving river. A public warning was issued designating the specific coordinates as an unstable landslide zone, strictly off limits to all hikers and commercial logging operations. The regional supervisor, who had seen the original, vanished report, chose to retire early a few months later. He packed up his desk, handed over his keys, and moved to a small town on the eastern edge of the province, far away from the deep woods. But he could never quite shake the memory of that night shift. He often thought about the speed with which the system had scrubbed the file, a deliberate erasure executed from a level of authority he could not even comprehend. Most of all, he thought about the audio file he never got to hear. Years later, rumors began to circulate among the older forest rangers. They whispered about illegal, deep earth acoustic scanning taking place in the remote sectors. They traded stories about campers who wandered too close to the hazard zones and reported hearing a sound that carried on the wind. It was not the sound of a landslide or a river or an animal. According to the locals who lived near the edge of the deep wilderness, on particularly quiet nights, you could stand at the boundary line and hear a low, continuous mechanical hum rising from beneath the roots of the trees. A case from 1998 in the Smoky Mountains was never closed. The dark green canvas backpack was found resting perfectly upright on a moss-covered log 7 miles off the designated trail. It was unzipped just enough to let the morning rain gather inside, yet the exterior remained unnaturally clean. There was no mud on the straps, no tear in the fabric from the dense thorns of the surrounding rhododendron thickets. It sat there in the heavy gray fog as if it had been placed by careful, deliberate hands only moments before the search team arrived. But there was no one around. There was only the endless, suffocating silence of the deep woods. The Great Smoky Mountains contain hollows and ravines that rarely see sunlight. In late October of 1998, the fog rolled through these valleys thick enough to swallow a person whole. A 32-year-old hiker traveling alone had walked into this mist 5 days earlier and simply ceased to exist. He had left no itinerary at the ranger station, only a brief note on the dashboard of his sedan parked near the trailhead. The note said he would return by Sunday evening. When Tuesday morning arrived with no sign of him, the search began. At first, the authorities treated it as a routine rescue operation. Hikers wander off the paths often. They twist ankles in the slick rocks, they lose their bearings in the sudden shifts of weather, they hunker down and wait for the flashlights of the search parties. But by the fourth day, the mood among the volunteers had shifted. The tracking dogs, usually reliable even in the damp mountain air, began to behave strangely. They would pull their handlers toward a specific ravine only to stop dead at the tree line, whine, and refuse to step any further into the brush. The discovery of the backpack on the fifth day was the first concrete piece of evidence. Inside, investigators found a spare wool sweater, a half-empty canteen, a topography map folded perfectly along its creases, and a single roll of 35mm film. There was no food, no compass, and no sleeping bag. The lead ranger noted in his report that the placement of the bag felt wrong. It was perched too precariously on the rotting log. A sudden gust of wind or the brush of a passing animal would have knocked it into the mud. It seemed staged, left behind as a marker for something the search party could not see. That evening, a severe storm grounded the helicopters and forced the search teams back to the staging area. The rain pounded the metal roof of the temporary command center, drowning out the static of the radio equipment. It was a miserable, cold night. Around 2:15 a.m., the radio operator caught a faint transmission on a closed channel used only by the park rangers. It was brief, just a few seconds of an open microphone. According to the official logs, there was no voice on the other end. There was only the rhythmic sound of a shovel striking soft, wet earth. Over and over, with a heavy, exhausted breathing layered underneath, the operator called out, asking for identification, assuming a ranger was out in the storm trying to free a trapped vehicle. The digging sound stopped. For a long moment, there was only the hiss of static. Then, a slow, deliberate click as the transmitter was turned off. The operator logged the event, feeling a sudden chill that he could not explain. The following morning, a specialized tracking team descended into the hollow where the backpack had been found. The rain had washed away most of the forest floor, turning it into a river of brown sludge. Yet, incredibly, they found footprints. They were isolated, appearing abruptly in a patch of soft clay near a swollen creek. But the stride of the prints was unnatural. The distance between the left foot and the right was nearly 6 feet. No human could walk with a stride that wide without running, yet the depth of the impressions suggested a slow, agonizingly heavy walk. The footprints did not trail off. They simply stopped. The final print was sunk deep into the clay, right at the edge of a sheer drop-off that plummeted 70 feet into a gorge of jagged slate. The searchers peered over the edge, expecting to find a broken body at the bottom, but there was nothing. No torn branches, no disturbed rocks, no blood, just the rushing water of the creek far below. A photographer with the search unit took 3 Polaroid pictures of the strange tracks. He placed them in a manila folder, sealing it with standard evidence tape. The folder was handed over to the chief investigator and locked in the evidence safe at the main ranger station that afternoon. The investigation was moving from a rescue mission to something much darker, though no one wanted to say it out loud. 3 days later, 2 local hunters who had joined the search effort reported finding a campsite. It was located an impossible 14 miles deep into the park in a sector of wilderness that was virtually impenetrable due to deadfall and briars. It took an entire afternoon for a ranger team to hack their way through the underbrush to reach the coordinates. What they found defied all logical explanation. A small single-person tent was set up in a small clearing, but it was not on the ground. The tent was suspended nearly 30 feet in the air, wedged tightly into the thick branches of an ancient oak tree. It was perfectly pitched, the nylon pulled taut, the stakes driven deep into the thick, rotting bark of the upper limbs. To assemble a tent with such precision on the ground was standard. To do it suspended 30 feet above the forest floor without ropes or climbing gear was something else entirely. A climber was brought in to scale the oak and inspect the tent. The rest of the team waited below in the silence of the growing dusk. According to the climber's statement, the zipper of the tent was secured from the outside. When he carefully pulled it open, shining his flashlight into the dark nylon cavity, he found it completely empty. But it was not undisturbed. The floor of the suspended tent was covered in a thick layer of crushed, dry autumn leaves, arranged perfectly into the shape of a sleeping human figure. The unnerving discoveries began to take a toll on the search teams. Volunteers stopped showing up, rumors began to circulate in the surrounding towns. Locals spoke of the old legends of the mountains, of things that lived deep in the hollows that could mimic the shapes of the lost. The police officially dismissed these rumors, focusing instead on the tangible evidence gathered so far. But the tangible evidence was about to become a problem. The lead investigator requested the manila folder containing the Polaroid photographs of the bizarre footprints. He unlocked the secure safe at the station, a safe to which only 3 people had the combination. He pulled out the folder. The evidence tape was still perfectly sealed. The signature across the seam was unbroken. But when he cut the tape with his pocket knife and opened the folder, it was empty. The photographs were gone. There was no logical way they could have been removed without tearing the envelope or breaking the seal. Confusion gave way to quiet panic within the precinct. The investigator immediately went to the audio archives to retrieve the cassette tape recording of the strange 2 a.m. radio transmission. He found the labeled plastic case sitting neatly on its designated shelf. He opened it, ready to play the sound of the digging for a newly assigned detective. The case contained a completely blank cassette. The tape had been entirely unspooled and cut out, leaving only the clear plastic reels. Pieces of the case were vanishing. It was as if the mountain itself was reaching into the concrete walls of the station and erasing the proof of what had happened. Paranoia set in among the staff. Accusations of tampering were whispered in the hallways, but no one could explain how or why a deputy would steal a photo of a footprint or a recording of static. The final piece of evidence remained: the single roll of 35mm film found in the abandoned backpack. It had been sent to a secure lab in a neighboring county to be developed, far away from the local station. A week after the search had stalled, a plain envelope arrived on the investigator's desk containing the developed photographs. There were 24 exposures on the roll. The first 22 were completely black. The lab technicians noted that the lens cap must have been on, or the photos were taken in absolute darkness without a flash. But the final 2 photographs contained images. The investigator laid them out on his desk under the harsh fluorescent light of his office. The 23rd photograph was taken in the woods, clearly at night. The harsh glare of the camera flash illuminated a thick wall of briars and twisted rhododendron branches. But slightly off-center, partially obscured by the leaves, was a figure. It was incredibly tall, easily over 7 feet, wrapped entirely in dark, wet canvas. It had no discernible face, just a pale, smooth surface where features should have been. It stood perfectly still among the thorns, facing the camera. The 24th photograph was the most disturbing. It was taken from a low angle, pointing straight up into the canopy of a massive oak tree. The flash caught the underside of a nylon tent suspended high in the branches. But the tent was not empty in this picture. A heavy, dark shape pressed against the thin nylon floor from the inside, bowing the material downward. And hanging by a single strap from a branch just below the tent, swinging slightly in the blurred exposure of the camera, was the hiker's dark green canvas backpack. The investigator stared at the photographs for hours. They contradicted everything the search team had found. The backpack had been discovered miles away from the suspended tent, resting on a log. If the backpack was in the tree when the photo was taken, who had moved it to the log, cleaned it, and left it for the rangers to find, and more importantly, who was operating the camera? He locked the two photographs in his desk drawer, intending to drive them to the Federal Bureau the next morning. He locked his office door. He walked out to his car in the quiet, damp evening air, feeling the weight of the dark mountains pressing down on the small town. He did not sleep that night. He listened to the wind rattling the window panes of his house, imagining the sound of a shovel biting into wet earth. When he returned to his office at 7:30 the next morning, his door was still locked. He sat at his desk, drank his coffee, and unlocked the bottom drawer to retrieve the photographs. The drawer was empty, there was no sign of forced entry, the locks had not been picked. The photographs, the final piece of physical evidence connecting the missing hiker to the strange anomalies in the woods, were simply gone. A thorough internal investigation yielded nothing. Polygraphs were administered to the staff, the station was searched from top to bottom, but the evidence was gone, just like the hiker. Without proof, the case grew cold. The search was officially suspended in November. The harsh winter snows covered the Great Smoky Mountains, burying the ravines and the hollows under feet of freezing white drift. By the spring of 1999, the missing man was declared legally dead. The case file was archived in a basement room filled with blank spaces and missing addendums. The official narrative was that a man wandered off the trail, succumbed to the elements, and his remains were likely scavenged by wildlife. It was a clean, logical story that the public could accept. But those who had been in the woods during those 5 days knew the truth was much darker. They remembered the wide, unnatural footprints. They remembered the empty tent suspended in the canopy. And the investigator remembered the pale, featureless face staring through the briars in a photograph that no longer existed. The case was never closed. It remains open, a silent stain on the records of the national park. The missing man's car was eventually towed away, the rust already eating at its edges. The woods reclaimed the paths cleared by the search teams. The ancient oak tree still stands somewhere deep in the hollows, its upper branches thick and twisted. According to local reports, hikers who wander too far off the trail in that specific sector still hear strange things when the fog rolls in. They speak of the sudden, suffocating silence that falls over the forest, a quiet so absolute it makes their ears ring. And occasionally, very late at night, campers claim to hear the rhythmic, distant sound of a shovel striking wet earth, digging a hole that no one will ever find. A Dartmore report described a voice that matched his wife. Exactly. It was 2:15 in the morning when the man stood completely still in his dark kitchen, listening to his wife call for help from the edge of the woods. Her voice was trembling, cutting through the dense fog that rolled off the tree line, begging him to open the back door. The sound was distinct and terrified, carrying the exact pitch and slight rasp she always had when she was frightened, but he did not reach for the deadbolt. He kept his hand pressed flat against the cold wood of the doorframe, his breathing shallow, because he could hear the steady, rhythmic breathing of his actual wife drifting down the stairs from their second-floor bedroom. The property sat at the end of a long, unpaved gravel road in Dartmore County, a deeply rural stretch of the Pacific Northwest known for its oppressive weather and vast, unbroken tracts of pine forest. According to local records, the area had always struggled with a spotty telephone network and a peculiar acoustic phenomenon. Sound traveled strangely across the damp valleys. A falling tree could sound like a gunshot, and the wind moving through the ravines often mimicked the drone of a low-flying airplane. But the voice filtering through the glass of the kitchen door was not a trick of the wind, it was a precise, flawless replication of a human voice layered with artificial emotion. The man, whose name was detailed in later police reports only as Thomas, remained in the dark. Outside, the pleading continued. The voice repeated the same 3 phrases in a loop. It asked him to come outside, it said it was cold, it said it had lost the flashlight. Thomas realized with a sinking sickness that these were the exact phrases his wife had used 3 years earlier during a camping trip in another state when she had briefly lost her way near their tent. The cadence was perfectly preserved, like an audio recording pressed into the damp night air. A heavy silence fell over the yard. The voice stopped mid-sentence, cutting off abruptly without any natural fade or intake of breath. Thomas pressed his cheek against the frosted glass of the back window, peering out into the impenetrable blackness. There was no movement near the tree line. The motion sensor light attached to the garage, which was sensitive enough to trigger when a stray deer wandered past, remained completely dark. Yet, he could hear the unmistakable sound of wet leaves compressing under heavy, deliberate footsteps. They were moving closer to the house, but the rhythm was entirely wrong. It sounded like something walking on two legs, but the steps were spaced too far apart, dragging slightly with every second stride. According to the incident report filed days later, Thomas finally backed away from the door and retrieved a heavy steel flashlight from the kitchen counter. He did not turn it on. He moved silently through the first floor, checking the locks on the heavy oak front door and the sliding glass panels in the living room. Every window was secured. As he stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent room, a new sound began. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping against the glass of the living room window. Thomas froze. The window was located on the side of the house where the ground dropped away into a steep ravine. To reach that glass from the outside, a person would need to be standing on a tall ladder, or they would have to be nearly 9 feet tall. The tapping continued, patient and unhurried. Then the voice returned, but it was no longer screaming, it was whispering right against the external pane of glass. It whispered Thomas's name over and over, mirroring the gentle, sleepy tone his wife used when waking him up in the morning. The history of Dartmore County is scattered with strange, fragmented reports of auditory anomalies. Archival newspaper clippings from the 1970s describe loggers walking off their job sites, claiming they heard their foreman calling them into deep, unmarked sections of the forest. In 1992, a search and rescue team spent 3 days looking for a missing hiker because they kept hearing his voice echoing from the bottom of a limestone gorge. When they finally found the man, he had been deceased for over 48 hours, making it medically impossible for him to have been shouting for help that morning. These incidents were often rationalized as echo delays or the stress-induced auditory hallucinations of exhausted searchers. But standing in his living room, Thomas knew he was not hallucinating. The whisper against the glass was too tactile, too physically present. The condensation on the outside of the window seemed to blur, disturbed by hot breath. Slowly, Thomas raised the heavy flashlight and clicked the beam on, aiming it directly at the window. The bright circle of light illuminated the swirling fog and the bare branches of an oak tree. There was nothing standing outside the glass. The air was empty. But the whispering did not stop. It simply shifted, the source of the sound moving rapidly along the exterior wall, traveling faster than a human could run. The voice slid along the vinyl siding, moving toward the front porch. Thomas tracked the sound from the inside, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He heard the wooden planks of the porch groan under a sudden, immense weight. Then came the sound of the front door handle jiggling. It was a violent, frantic rattling, as if someone was desperately trying to force the lock. Thomas raised the flashlight like a weapon, bracing himself. Over the noise of the rattling handle, a new voice spoke. It was deep, panicked, and distinctly male. It was his own voice. The voice outside the door was screaming to let him in. It was a flawless imitation of Thomas shouting for his wife, demanding she unlock the door and call 911. Thomas listened to himself panic. He listened to the exact timbre of his own terror, a terror he was currently feeling but had not yet voiced aloud. The mimicry was so uncanny that for a fleeting, disorienting second, Thomas felt a severe detachment from his own body. He wondered wildly if he was the one trapped outside in the freezing fog, and the thing standing inside the dark hallway was the imposter. Up on the second floor, a floorboard creaked. Thomas snapped out of his paralyzing trance. The noise outside the front door vanished instantly, plunging the house back into suffocating silence. He heard his wife's footsteps moving slowly down the carpeted stairs. She called out his name, her voice thick with sleep and confusion. Thomas immediately warned her to stay back, to stay on the stairs. He kept his flashlight trained on the front door, the solid wood suddenly looking very fragile. She asked him what was going on, why he was standing in the dark. He did not know how to explain that he had just spent 20 minutes listening to both of them beg for their lives from the other side of the walls. They sat together on the floor of the upstairs hallway until dawn, the bedroom door locked, waiting for the sun to burn off the fog. The local police arrived shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. 2 deputies walked the perimeter of the house while Thomas and his wife watched from the kitchen window. The officers found no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact, the glass was undisturbed, and the motion sensor lights were confirmed to be in perfect working order. However, the official police report noted one peculiar detail that the deputies could not easily dismiss. In the damp soil beneath the living room window, the window that overlooked the steep drop-off into the ravine, there were deep impressions in the mud. They were not footprints, they were long, smooth drag marks, as if something incredibly heavy and completely lacking limbs had pulled itself back and forth beneath the glass. The marks stretched all the way around the foundation of the house, leading up the steps to the front porch, and eventually disappearing into the thick brush at the edge of the tree line. Desperate for proof that they were not losing their grip on reality, Thomas purchased a digital audio recorder from an electronics store 50 miles away. He placed it on the wooden railing of the front porch, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from the creeping dampness of the fog. He set it to activate only when it detected a sound louder than a whisper. For 3 nights, the device captured nothing but the low hum of the wind and the occasional patter of freezing rain against the wooden deck. On the 4th morning, the digital display indicated that 42 minutes of audio had been recorded between the hours of 3 a.m. and 4 o'clock in the morning. Thomas and his wife sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the windows, and pressed play. At first, there was only static. Then, the distinct crunch of gravel. Something heavy was dragging itself up the driveway. The sound was wet, accompanied by a low, rhythmic wheezing that did not sound remotely biological. Then, the voices began. It was not just Thomas and his wife. The recorder had captured a chaotic, layered chorus of conversations. They heard a mail carrier they had spoken to weeks ago asking about a stray dog. They heard a neighbor complaining about a fallen tree. They heard the 911 dispatcher from the night of the first incident repeating her calm, practiced instructions on a loop. The entity outside was practicing. It was sifting through an archive of stolen sounds, testing syllables, adjusting its pitch, searching for the frequency that would compel someone to unlock the door. The most disturbing part of the recording came at the very end. The layered voices abruptly cut out, leaving a hollow, dead silence. Then, a voice spoke directly into the microphone. It was impossibly close, the breathing heavily distorted by the plastic bag. It was the voice of Thomas's wife, humming a tuneless, repetitive melody. It was a melody she only ever hummed while she was completely alone, folding laundry in the basement. The entity had been listening to them long before it ever made itself known. The illusion of safety shattered permanently on a Tuesday evening in late November. The sun had set early, casting long, bruised shadows across the yard. Thomas's wife was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, while Thomas was in the basement organizing a set of tools. The basement was unfinished, a cavernous space of exposed concrete and damp earth, lit by a single bulb swinging from a wire. As he sorted through a box of nails, he heard her call down the wooden stairs. She asked him to come up and look at something outside the window. Her voice was calm, casual, lacking any trace of alarm. Thomas dropped a handful of nails back into the box and began walking toward the staircase. He had his foot on the bottom step when his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from his wife. It read that she had just driven into town to pick up milk from the grocery store and would be back in 20 minutes. Thomas stared at the glowing screen, the cold air of the basement suddenly feeling like ice against his skin. From the top of the dark staircase, the voice spoke again. It repeated the exact same phrase with the exact same casual intonation. It asked him to come up and look at something outside. Thomas did not answer. He slowly backed away from the stairs, retreating into the shadows of the concrete walls. He realized that the voice was not coming from the kitchen. It was coming from the narrow gap beneath the door at the top of the stairs, vibrating through the wood with an unnatural, mechanical precision. He stood in the damp darkness for what felt like hours, gripping a heavy iron wrench in his right hand. Above him, the pacing began. It was not the sound of dragging, but the heavy, deliberate thud of boots walking across the hardwood floor of the kitchen. The footsteps matched Thomas's own gait perfectly. He listened as the entity moved through their home, opening cabinets, running the faucet, mimicking the mundane sounds of a quiet evening. It was playing house. It was wearing their routine like a stolen piece of clothing. When the headlights of his wife's car finally swept across the driveway, the footsteps above him abruptly stopped. Thomas heard the front door open, heard his wife calling out a greeting, the rustle of paper grocery bags being set on the counter. He waited for another voice to answer her. He waited for a scream, but there was only silence, followed by her footsteps walking toward the basement door. She opened it and called down, asking why he was sitting in the dark. Her voice was real. The air in the house had returned to normal. They moved out of Dartmore County exactly 4 days later. They broke their lease, packed only what could fit in the back of their vehicle, and left the heavy furniture behind. They never returned to collect the rest. The property sat vacant for years, slowly being reclaimed by the aggressive overgrowth of the Pacific Northwest. The windows became clouded with grime, and the roof eventually sagged under the weight of accumulated pine needles. But the legend of the Dartmore mimic remains a quietly discussed topic among the locals who live near the state forest. Hikers are strictly advised to stay on marked trails and to never venture into the woods alone. The warning is not just for the risk of getting lost or encountering wildlife, it is because of the reports that still occasionally surface at the local ranger station. Reports of hikers hearing their own names called from the bottom of deep ravines. Reports of missing campers whose voices are heard crying out in the fog, weeks after the search operations have been officially suspended. There is one detail from Thomas's final police report that locals rarely mention to outsiders. When he finally walked upstairs that night, after his wife had returned from the store, he noticed something resting on the kitchen counter. Next to the paper grocery bags was the heavy steel flashlight he had used during the first incident weeks prior. He had left it on his bedside table that morning, but there it sat, perfectly centered on the counter, still cold to the touch. The entity had not just mimicked their voices, it had left a quiet, mocking proof that it had been inside all along, watching them learn how to be afraid. A Maine case from 1994 involved knocking for 7 nights. It started on the second night of November, 1994, at exactly 2:15 a.m., with a sound that did not belong in the deep, isolated woods of northern Maine. A heavy, rhythmic thudding against the thick, double-paned glass of a sliding patio door. Sarah Elias woke with a sudden, freezing jolt, the heavy woolen blankets pulled tightly up to her chin. The cabin was entirely dark, the surrounding forest swallowed by a black, moonless winter night. She lay perfectly still in her second-floor bedroom, her breath creating faint clouds in the freezing air, waiting to see if the sound had been born from a fading dream. 10 seconds later, the sound returned. It was methodical, blunt, and immensely heavy. 3 slow strikes, a long, agonizing pause, 3 more strikes. The Elias cabin was situated at the end of a 4-mile dirt logging road near the dense, sprawling shores of Moosehead Lake. The nearest permanent neighbor was located across a frozen inlet, entirely inaccessible during the bitter winter storms that routinely buried the region. Sarah had traveled there alone to clear out the property, preparing the old structure for a long overdue family sale. The power had failed hours earlier beneath the weight of ice forming thick layers on the remote power lines, plunging the house into complete darkness. When the knocking first pulled her from sleep, her rational mind frantically searched for an explanation. She assumed it was a lost hunter, or perhaps a stranded motorist who had somehow managed to navigate the treacherous, unplowed logging road. But the wind outside was howling, driving sharp ice against the wooden siding of the house in a chaotic roar, while the knock remained distinct, unhurried, and perfectly timed. She wrapped a heavy woolen blanket tightly around her shoulders, picked up a heavy iron flashlight from her bedside table, and walked slowly down the narrow, creaking wooden staircase. The cabin was freezing, the internal temperature dropping rapidly without the hum of the electric furnace. The beam of her flashlight cut a pale, dusty yellow circle through the oppressive darkness of the living room, illuminating the worn rug and the stone fireplace. When she finally reached the sliding glass door at the back of the house, she fully expected to see a desperate face pressed against the frost, begging for shelter. Instead, there was only the black, mirrored reflection of the room behind her. She reached out and flipped the wall switch for the exterior floodlight, acting on pure, ingrained habit, fully aware the backup generator was not running. The knocking stopped the exact second her fingertips touched the cold plastic of the switch. Morning broke gray and blindingly cold, casting long skeletal shadows through the ancient pine trees that surrounded the property. Sarah, dressed in heavy layers, laced up her thick winter boots and walked the perimeter of the cabin to investigate. The snow was pristine, sparkling under the muted light, completely untouched by human boots or the heavy paws of a wandering bear. The area directly beneath the patio door was completely smooth, presenting a solid, unbroken sheet of white powder stretching out toward the dark tree line. There was absolutely no physical evidence that anyone or anything had stood on the wooden deck the night before. Desperate for comfort, she convinced herself it had been a heavy, frozen tree branch driven by the storm striking the glass in a strange, repetitive rhythm. She spent the rest of the short daylight hours chopping firewood, bringing the heavy logs inside, and securing the thick wooden storm shutters over all the ground floor windows. The second night thoroughly destroyed any comforting, rational theories she had built during the daylight hours. At exactly midnight, the knocking returned, but it was no longer testing the glass of the patio door. It began at the heavy oak front door of the cabin. The sound was incredibly blunt, echoing through the empty wooden entryway with a startling, violent volume. 3 heavy strikes, a long, agonizing pause of exactly 1 minute, 3 more strikes. Sarah sat on the top step of the second floor landing, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs, her hands trembling as she clutched a heavy iron fire poker. She sat in absolute darkness, listening carefully as the source of the sound slowly began to move. It did not sound like footsteps moving across the wooden boards of the front porch. There was no familiar crunching of heavy boots in the deep snow, no creaking of the frozen wooden planks, no rustling of winter coats. There was only the dreadful, vast silence of the winter night, followed suddenly by 3 heavy strikes against the kitchen window on the eastern side of the house. 10 minutes later, the terrifying knocking shifted to the living room window on the western wall. Whatever was waiting outside was slowly circling the property, testing the perimeter, searching for a weakness in the walls. The strikes were so forceful that Sarah could hear the old window frames rattling violently in their wooden casements. She spent the remainder of the night huddled in the furthest corner of her bedroom, her back pressed hard against the cold plaster, watching the locked bedroom door until the sun finally began to rise at 6:30 in the morning. On the 3rd day, the paralyzing fear was replaced by a desperate need to escape. She packed a small canvas duffel bag, determined to drive the 4 miles down the logging road to the nearest paved highway, no matter how deep the snowdrifts had become. The outside temperature had plunged to 5 degrees below zero, freezing the moisture inside her nose with every breath. When she climbed into her pickup truck and turned the heavy metal key in the ignition, the engine did not turn over. There was no clicking of the starter, no struggling whine of the motor, no dimming of the dashboard lights. When she lifted the heavy steel hood of the truck, she found that the thick battery cables had been severed. It was not the jagged gnawing of a desperate, starving animal. The cuts were perfectly clean, sliced straight through the thick rubber and heavy copper wire with absolute precision. She was entirely isolated, stranded 40 miles from the nearest town. The 3rd night brought a terrifying, impossible shift in the pattern. The knocking did not start at the doors or the windows. At exactly 11:15 p.m., the heavy, hollow sound came from directly above her head. Something was moving on the steep, slanted roof of the cabin. The heavy wooden support beams groaned under a sudden, immense, shifting weight, followed immediately by 3 hollow thuds against the frozen asphalt shingles. The terrible sound vibrated down through the wooden framework of the house, shaking decades of loose dust onto the bedroom floor. Sarah stared wide-eyed at the ceiling, paralyzed by the sheer physical impossibility of the situation. The roof of the cabin was pitched at a severe angle designed to shed heavy snowfall and was currently covered in 3 feet of slick, deadly ice. Nothing should have been able to stand up there, let alone strike the wood with such methodical, deliberate, and devastating force. The roof knocking continued for a full hour, dragging slowly from one end of the cabin to the other before sudden silence fell over the property. Sarah waited in the dark, her breath pluming in the freezing air of the bedroom, her grip tightening on the iron poker. Just as her exhausted muscles began to relax, the 3 strikes returned. This time, they came from deep beneath the wooden floorboards on the first floor. The cabin sat elevated on a shallow dirt crawl space, barely high enough for an adult to drag themselves through on their stomach in total darkness. The sound was slightly muffled by the thick fiberglass insulation stuffed between the joists, but the rhythm remained entirely identical. 3 strikes. A 1-minute pause. 3 strikes. Something was positioned directly beneath the living room floor, knocking upward against the wood, tracking her movements through the ceiling. By the 4th day, severe sleep deprivation had begun to warp the edges of her reality. Shadows pooling in the corners of the empty rooms seemed to stretch, quiver, and linger just a moment too long when she moved her flashlight. The vast silence of the house was deafening, pressing heavily against her ears like deep water. She ventured outside for only 10 minutes to frantically gather the remaining firewood from the outdoor shed. It was during this panic trip that she noticed the perimeter of the house. There were still no footprints anywhere in the deep snow, but there was a continuous, shallow trench perfectly circling the cabin. It looked exactly as if a heavy, smooth, rounded object had been dragged slowly through the snow, maintaining an exact distance of 2 feet away from the exterior walls. The bizarre trench never deviated in its distance from the house, forming a perfect, unbroken circle around her prison. The 5th night marked the terrifying turning point in the ordeal. The massive winter storm outside had completely died down, leaving a still, crystalline cold in its wake. The silence of the forest was absolute, almost suffocating. At exactly 2 in the morning, the knocking began once again, but it severely lacked the muffled, hollow distance of the previous nights. The sound was sharp, incredibly resonant, and entirely too close. Sarah realized, with a sickening, dizzying drop in her stomach, that the knocking was coming from inside the walls of the house. It was echoing directly up from the darkness of the basement stairwell. She had securely locked the heavy basement door on the very first day, even taking the time to shove a heavy wooden dresser across the hallway to block the frame. Now, as she stood frozen in absolute terror at the top of the main staircase, she listened to the horrifying rhythm. 3 heavy thuds against the inner wood of the basement door. A 1-minute pause, 3 more thuds. Whatever had been circling the cabin in the snow, whatever had been dragging itself beneath the floorboards, was now standing on the wooden basement steps, violently knocking to get into the main hallway. Sarah backed away slowly, retreating silently up the stairs, never taking her wide eyes off the dark landing below. Once inside her bedroom, she locked the door, braced a wooden chair under the handle, and pushed her heavy oak bed frame across the floor to barricade herself in. On the 6th night, the patterned knocking escalated into a continuous, deafening assault that defied all reason. It began immediately at sundown and simply did not stop. It came from all sides of the house simultaneously. The heavy oak front door, the back wooden deck, the shuttered kitchen windows, the steep roof, and the barricaded basement door were all struck at once. The heavy, rhythmic thuds overlapped in the darkness, creating a maddening tribal drumbeat that literally shook the entire structure of the house. The framed family photographs lining the hallway vibrated right off their rusty nails, shattering violently on the hardwood floors. Sarah sat huddled tightly in the dead center of her bedroom floor, rocking back and forth with her hands pressed painfully hard over her ears. Desperate for anything else, she turned on a small battery-operated emergency radio, hoping to catch the local weather band, praying to hear a human voice. She rotated the small plastic dial with trembling fingers, pushing through thick walls of buzzing static. There were no voices, there was no music, there was no emergency broadcast, but as she tuned slowly past a dead frequency, the thick static suddenly dropped away into a low, droning electric hum. From the small, tinny speaker of the radio, she heard the sound. 3 heavy strikes. A pause. 3 heavy strikes. The radio was broadcasting the exact rhythm of the knocking that was currently tearing her house apart. It was as if the small device had tuned directly into the very frequency of the terror waiting outside. She violently crushed the plastic radio beneath the heel of her heavy winter boot, permanently silencing the speaker, but the overlapping knocking against the wooden walls continued unceasingly until the first pale light of dawn. The 7th night brought a completely different, infinitely worse kind of horror. There was no overlapping chaos, no deafening barrage against the exterior walls. Instead, there was an absolute, suffocating, breathless silence. Sarah waited in the freezing dark of her deeply barricaded bedroom, clutching a large steel hunting knife, her eyes wide and burning fiercely from exhaustion. The antique mechanical clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room, counting down the dreadful minutes. Midnight passed without incident. 1 a.m. passed. 2 a.m. passed in total silence. She began to desperately hope that the terrible ordeal was finally over, that whatever had laid siege to the cabin had finally moved on into the deep, frozen woods. Then, at exactly 3:43 a.m., she heard it. The knocking did not come from the exterior walls of the house. It did not come from the steep roof or the dark basement. The 3 slow, methodical strikes came from the empty space of the wall directly behind her wooden headboard, the thin interior wall that separated her bedroom from the empty spare guest room. She slowly crawled backward away from the bed, moving silently toward the far corner of the room, her breathing shallow and ragged. Exactly 1 minute later, the knocking moved. It struck the heavy wooden panels of her own locked bedroom door from the hallway side. Then, incredibly, the sound moved entirely outside. It struck the exterior glass of her second-floor bedroom window, a window that was suspended exactly 30 feet in the air, featuring no balcony, no fire escape, and absolutely no tree branches anywhere nearby. After the 3 terrifying strikes on the second-story glass, the rhythm finally broke for the very first time. Instead of a 1-minute pause, a completely new sound began. A slow, agonizing, ear-piercing screech of heavy metal dragging against the frosty glass. It sounded exactly like a thick, rusted iron nail being slowly pulled across the fragile window pane, searching blindly for a seam, searching for a weakness in the wooden frame. The terrible scratching moved slowly from the top left corner of the window entirely down to the bottom right, sending a violent, sickening shiver straight down Sarah's spine. She crawled desperately into the small bedroom closet, pulled a pile of heavy winter coats completely over her head, squeezed her eyes shut in the absolute darkness, and waited in terror for the sound of shattering glass. 4 days later, a massive Yellow County snowplow finally managed to break through the towering snowdrifts blocking the old logging road, clearing a passable path all the way to the Elias property. 2 local deputies followed closely behind in a 4-wheel drive vehicle, responding to a frantic, repeated welfare check requested by Sarah's worried family down in Boston. When the officers finally arrived, they found the isolated cabin half buried in fresh, sparkling snow. There was no smoke rising from the stone chimney. The heavy oak front door was entirely unlocked, swinging slightly inward with the bitter cold winter breeze. The deputies immediately drew their service weapons and stepped cautiously inside the freezing dark, loudly calling out her name. The cabin remained utterly, completely silent. The interior of the house was freezing, but perfectly, immaculately tidy. The kitchen counters were clean and wiped down, the living room furniture was undisturbed, the heavy wooden shutters were still tightly secured over all the ground floor windows. But when the 2 deputies slowly reached the back hallway, they found the heavy wooden dresser pushed violently aside. The thick door leading down to the dark basement was securely closed, but the wood itself was severely, unimaginably damaged. Hundreds of deep, jagged, overlapping indentations completely covered the surface of the wooden door, looking exactly as if someone had struck it repeatedly with terrifying strength using the rounded end of a heavy iron sledgehammer. The thick wood was splintered, cracked, and concaved inward, yet the heavy brass deadbolt remained perfectly locked from the outside. Sarah Elias was never found. The county police searched the surrounding winter woods for 2 solid weeks using highly trained tracking dogs, but the dogs completely refused to step past the initial tree line, simply sitting down in the deep snow and whining nervously at the dark, empty gaps between the towering pine trees. The official missing person report, formally filed on the 14th of November 1994, remains permanently open in the county archives, gathering dust in a filing cabinet. The Elias cabin stood completely empty for 20 long years before finally collapsing under the immense crushing weight of a severe winter storm. But the locals still strictly avoid the old logging road once the sun goes down. According to the older, superstitious residents of the town, if you park your car near the rotting ruins at exactly 2 in the morning and turn off your engine, you do not hear the wind blowing through the trees. You hear 3 hollow, rhythmic thuds echoing slowly and patiently from deep within the frozen black earth. A missing 411 case where footprints suddenly stopped. The footprints in the morning frost did not fade away slowly, nor did they show any signs of a struggle or a sudden violent fall. They simply stopped. It was near the edge of a high granite ridge, about 2 miles north of the main trail, in an area of the state forest thick with ancient pine and jagged limestone outcroppings. The search coordinator, a man who had spent 30 years tracking missing persons through these specific mountains, knelt and stared at the final depression in the pale white earth. The left boot print was deep, pressing heavily through the crisp layer of frost and into the damp, dark soil beneath. There was no right boot print to follow it. Beyond that single heavy indentation, there was only a vast, undisturbed sheet of frost covering the flat stone of the ridge. Nothing had brushed against the nearby ferns. No low-hanging branches were broken. It was as if the man had stepped forward with his left foot and simply ceased to be tethered to the ground. The geography of the upper basin was notoriously deceptive, a sprawling network of deep ravines and dense timber that could easily turn a seasoned hiker around. But the missing man was not a tourist. His name was Elias, a local surveyor who knew the topography of the northern ridge better than anyone in the county. He had walked out of his small cabin at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in late October. The air that day had been crisp but clear, the kind of autumn morning that drew locals deep into the woods before the heavy winter snows arrived. He was dressed appropriately for the season in a heavy wool jacket, sturdy leather boots, and carried a small canvas pack with enough supplies to last well through the afternoon. According to the missing person report, Elias had only intended to check a line of remote trail cameras he maintained along the eastern edge of the property line. His wife told the 911 operator that he knew every stone and creek in that section of the woods. He had promised to return by noon for lunch. When 3 o'clock in the afternoon passed with no sign of him, a quiet, creeping unease settled over the house. When dusk arrived, bringing with it a sharp drop in temperature and the deep, total darkness of the mountain valley, that unease turned into a pressing emergency. By midnight, the first official search teams had already assembled at the trailhead with high-powered flashlights, radios, and a team of tracking dogs. The tracking dogs provided the first clear indication that this would not be a standard search and rescue operation. The handlers brought 3 experienced bloodhounds to the front porch of the cabin, allowing them to catch Elias's scent from a worn flannel shirt. Initially, the dogs performed exactly as trained. They pulled eagerly at their long leashes, leading the handlers up the familiar winding incline behind the property. They moved swiftly for the first hour, cutting through the dense, dark timber with absolute purpose, their noses close to the damp earth. But as the search party crossed the lower tree line and entered the shadow of the upper ridge, the behavior of the animals drastically changed. The lead dog suddenly stopped pulling. It lowered its head, sniffing frantically at a single patch of dead, frozen grass, before letting out a low, trembling whine and backing away. Within minutes, all three dogs sat rigidly in the cold dirt, refusing to take another step forward. They did not bark at the darkness. They did not circle looking for a lost scent. They simply sat close to their handlers, staring up into the black canopy of the towering pines, shivering violently despite their thick coats. The handlers eventually had to carry the dogs back down the trail, leaving the human volunteers to push forward alone. Witnesses in the search party later claimed that the woods felt entirely dead that night. The wind, which usually howled relentlessly through the narrow canyons of the basin, had dropped to an absolute unnatural standstill. The silence was so profound and heavy that the searchers could hear the blood rushing in their own ears, and the rhythmic squeak of their waterproof gear seemed to echo for miles. Usually, the forest at night was alive with the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the sharp creak of settling wood, and the distant, lonely call of owls. But on that night, several seasoned rangers reported feeling an immense, suffocating pressure in the air, as if they were walking through the interior of a massive, soundproof room. Every beam of light sweeping through the trees seemed to stop short, swallowed by an unusual density in the dark. At 3:30 a.m., a team of volunteers sweeping the floor of the lower ravine found the first physical piece of evidence. It was Elias's canvas backpack, sitting perfectly upright on the flat, mossy surface of a large river boulder. It had not been dropped in a panic or thrown aside in a rush. The shoulder straps were neatly arranged, tucked carefully beneath the base of the bag, and all the buckles were securely fastened. Inside, they found his metal water bottle, entirely full, alongside his compass and a spare pair of heavy insulated gloves. The most unsettling detail of the discovery was the placement of his two-way radio. It was resting perfectly balanced on top of the closed backpack. The power switch was turned on, indicating the battery was still alive, but the volume dial had been rotated completely down to zero. It was a bizarre and troubling contradiction. A man lost or injured in the wilderness relies on a radio as his primary lifeline to the outside world. To deliberately silence the device and abandon it so carefully on a rock suggested either a calm, intentional choice to vanish or a state of mind that could no longer comprehend the concept of rescue. As the sun finally rose, casting long, pale, gray shadows across the basin, the trackers located a distinct set of boot prints in the soft mud near the boulder. The tracks clearly belonged to Elias, perfectly matching the heavy, deep-lug tread pattern of his winter boots, but the path they carved through the landscape made no logical sense. Instead of heading back down the gradual slope toward the safety of the valley and the highway, the prints turned away from home. They aimed directly toward the steepest, most unforgiving section of the mountain, a tangled mass of briars and loose scree. According to the lead rescue coordinator, the stride of the footprints was deeply alarming. The distance between the left and right impressions was impossibly wide. The spacing suggested that Elias was either running at a breakneck, desperate speed up a 45-degree incline, or taking massive, leaping bounds through thick underbrush that should have been physically impenetrable. A human being could not maintain that kind of momentum up a mountain face without tripping, stumbling, or leaving signs of broken branches and crushed vegetation. Yet, the tracks were clean, perfectly spaced, and relentless in their upward trajectory. 200 yards further up the punishing incline, the team found another piece of the puzzle, and it only deepened the growing sense of dread. Draped carefully over a low-hanging hemlock branch was Elias's heavy wool winter jacket. It was not torn, snagged, or hastily discarded. It had been meticulously unbuttoned, taken off, and folded neatly over the damp wood. The temperature in the valley had dipped to 28 degrees overnight. Stripping off a primary layer of winter clothing in sub-freezing conditions is a recognized symptom of late-stage hypothermia, a fatal phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, where a freezing brain falsely signals to the body that it is burning up. Yet, the veteran trackers noted immediately that the timeline for hypothermia simply did not fit the physical evidence. Based on the distance from his cabin, Elias would have reached this specific spot only 2 or 3 hours after leaving home, far too early for the deep, delirious final stages of freezing to set in. Furthermore, the victims of hypothermia walk with a staggering, chaotic gait as their motor functions shut down. Elias's footprints leading away from the abandoned jacket remain straight, deep, and incredibly wide, showing a level of physical power and purpose that directly contradicted the symptoms of a dying man. At 9:15 a.m., the radio operator stationed back at the base camp experienced a highly unusual anomaly. For several uninterrupted minutes, a burst of thick, heavy static broke through the primary search and rescue channel. The operator attempted to clear the frequency, asking for any team in the field to identify themselves and report their status. The static did not break. Instead, it slowly shifted in tone and pitch, forming a rhythmic mechanical pulse that sounded almost like heavy, labored breathing, echoing through miles of empty, hollow pipe. Behind the dense wall of static, faint, metallic clicking sounds began to echo in a slow, deliberate, and entirely unnatural pattern. The transmission lasted for exactly 2 minutes before the channel snapped back to dead, empty silence. The operator immediately radioed all the search teams in the field. Every unit confirmed that their radios were secure and none of them had triggered their microphones. The origin of the signal was never traced, and no other frequencies in the area reported the interference. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the primary tracking team finally reached the high granite ridge. The punishing terrain here leveled out into a barren, windswept expanse of pale stone, broken only by thin, shallow patches of frosted soil and dead moss. This was the exact location where they found the final, impossible sequence of footprints. They followed the wide, bounding strides across a shallow depression of dirt that led toward the sudden drop-off of the cliff. The tracks moved in a perfectly straight, unwavering line. The searchers walked parallel to the prints, giving them a wide berth, deeply careful not to disturb the evidence. They counted exactly 12 massive steps across the morning frost. And then there was the 13th step. The left boot drove deep into the soft, yielding earth, crushing a thick layer of dead green moss. The toe of the print was angled slightly forward, deeply embedded, implying a tremendous amount of forward momentum. But there was absolutely no right footprint to follow it. The trackers instantly fanned out, circling the immediate area in a wide 50-foot radius. They shone high-powered flashlights into the narrow, dark crevices of the surrounding rock. They swept the distant tree line, looking for any sign of broken timber. They looked for signs that Elias had jumped to another rock, but the nearest boulder was 30 feet away. They looked for signs of a sudden fall, a dragging rope, or the massive sweeping tracks of a large predator that might have carried a man away. There was nothing to be found. The earth was entirely undisturbed. The delicate crystalline frost on the granite just inches away from that final boot print remained entirely intact, glittering like broken glass under the cold, pale sunlight. The trail simply ceased to exist. As the searchers stood in a circle around the impossible end of the trail, the atmosphere in the upper basin violently shifted. The oppressive, heavy silence of the morning was suddenly broken by a deep, low humming wind that seemed to vibrate directly through the thick rubber soles of their boots. The sky above the ridge, which had been a clear, piercing, cloudless blue just moments before, darkened with a terrifying and unnatural speed. Thick, bruised, gray clouds rolled over the jagged peaks, sealing the valley floor in a sudden, premature twilight. The temperature plummeted 10 degrees in a matter of minutes, chilling the sweat on the necks of the searchers. Small, hard pellets of ice began to fall from the blackening sky, striking the granite ridge with sharp, rhythmic taps that sounded like scattering nails. The lead rescue coordinator knew the brutal protocol for sudden mountain weather. A squall moving this fast in the upper basin could easily trap, freeze, and kill an entire team of experienced men. Reluctantly, with a heavy heart, he keyed his radio and gave the absolute order to abandon the ridge and fall back to the staging area. The men cast one last, long look at the single, final boot print resting alone in the frost before turning away and beginning the dangerous descent. By the time they reached the safety of the lower tree line, the snow was falling in heavy, blinding horizontal sheets. The unseasonal storm locked the mountain down for 3 full days, burying the high ridge under 4 feet of dense, heavy, wet snow. The weather effectively erased the strange trail, destroyed any remaining scent markers, and buried whatever evidence might have been left on the stone. When the deep thaw finally came weeks later, local rangers made one last quiet attempt to search the high areas of the basin. They did not find Elias. They did not find his remains, his missing clothing, or his other boot. They did, however, find one of the remote trail cameras he had gone out into the woods to check on that very first morning. It was strapped tightly to the trunk of an old birch tree about 1 mile south of where his footprints had inexplicably vanished. The plastic outer casing of the camera was deeply cracked, and the battery cover was missing, but the memory card sealed inside the waterproof housing was miraculously still intact. Investigators pulled the memory card and reviewed the digital footage in a locked, windowless room back at the local ranger station. According to the heavily redacted incident report later obtained by researchers, the camera had captured only a single, silent photograph at 2:45 p.m. on the day Elias disappeared. The image was incredibly grainy, shot in poor lighting under the dense, shadowing canopy of the pines. In the extreme foreground of the image, the very edge of Elias's heavy wool jacket was partially visible. It was slightly out of focus and blurred, capturing the exact moment he was walking past the hidden lens. But the true focus of the camera's automated sensor was drawn to the distant background. Deep in the dark, tangled timber, perfectly aligned with the direction Elias was walking, the shapes of the ancient trees appeared strangely distorted and bent. The shadows in the photograph did not match the natural angle of the afternoon sun. Instead, the darkness seemed to pool together into a single, unnatural, towering shape that stood between the trees, appearing to absorb all the ambient light around it. There were no distinct facial features, no reflections of eyes, and no recognizable outline of a natural animal. It was just a profound, empty, towering mass of darkness standing perfectly still among the pines, waiting on the exact path that Elias was walking toward. The case of the missing surveyor remains officially open, filed quietly under unexplained local disappearances. The dense woods surrounding the upper basin were eventually closed to casual hikers, with the state citing dangerously unstable terrain and deeply unpredictable weather patterns as the official reason. But those who have lived in the shadow of the valley for generations still talk quietly about the man who walked up the mountain and simply stepped off the face of the earth. The story has woven itself into the fabric of the local folklore, becoming a whispered warning passed down to young hunters. They say that sometimes, in the absolute dead of winter, when the biting wind completely drops and the ancient trees grow utterly, unnaturally silent, you can still find massive, wide, bounding footprints carved deeply into the fresh snow. Those foolish enough to track them follow the impossible strides for miles, winding through the darkest and most isolated parts of the forest until they finally reach an open clearing or a high, lonely ridge. And there, alone in the freezing, absolute silence, the tracks always stop. The chamber beneath the Pennsylvania clay. There is a specific kind of silence that belongs only to the deep countryside of rural Pennsylvania in the dead of winter. It is not an empty silence. It is heavy, pressing against the windows of isolated homes, thick with the weight of frozen earth and dormant trees. For generations, people living out where the dirt roads end have understood that old houses settle, wooden beams groan, and the wind can mimic the sound of a voice. But there are other sounds that do not belong to the wind or the shifting foundation. Sounds that pull themselves up from the dark, damp earth beneath the floorboards. In the late autumn of 1996, a young family purchased a sprawling, isolated farmhouse situated on 20 acres of overgrown land. The property had sat vacant for over a decade. The previous owners had departed quietly, leaving behind furniture, unwashed dishes, and a reputation among locals that the property was simply too far from town, too secluded, and perhaps too strange to comfortably inhabit. The new owners, a husband, a wife, and their young daughter, saw only the charm of a 19th century build. They appreciated the heavy oak beams, the wide plank floors, and the sprawling root cellar that promised a connection to a simpler, older way of life. For the first 2 months, the house was merely a quiet sanctuary. The family spent their days stripping ancient wallpaper and repainting the bedrooms. When evening fell, the absolute darkness of the countryside swallowed the property. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles down a winding gravel road. There were no streetlights, no passing cars, and no ambient noise from a nearby town. There was only the house, standing alone against the tree line. The subtle shift in the atmosphere began just after the first hard freeze in early December. According to the reports filed much later, the wife was the first to notice the sound. It happened at roughly 2:15 in the morning. She awoke to a profound stillness in her bedroom, a silence so deep it felt as though the air had been pulled from the house. Then a slow, heavy thud echoed from the floor beneath her bed. It was not the sharp crack of wood settling in the cold, it was a dull, rhythmic impact. It sounded like something wrapped in heavy fabric being dragged across a stone floor, followed by a long, agonizing pause, and then another thud. She lay awake for an hour, listening as the dragging sound moved in a tight, restless circle directly beneath the central hallway on the ground floor. The layout of the farmhouse dictated that whatever was making the noise had to be in the deepest part of the basement, a section of the old root cellar that the family had largely ignored due to its overwhelming smell of mildew and wet clay. When morning came, the sounds ceased. The daylight brought logic and rational explanations. The husband suggested it was an old water pipe shuddering in the cold, or perhaps a raccoon that had found its way beneath the foundation. A week passed. The sounds did not return every night, but when they did, they always began after midnight. The rhythm remained identical, a heavy, dragging thud, a pause, a scrape of something hard against stone. It became impossible to sleep through. The atmosphere inside the home grew tense, the air feeling thick and charged with an unspoken anxiety. The family began to walk softly through their own hallways, instinctively afraid of waking whatever seemed to be restless beneath their feet. Late one Saturday afternoon, determined to find the source of the disturbance, the husband took a heavy flashlight and descended the narrow, creaking wooden stairs into the cellar. The basement was divided into 2 distinct sections. The first was a modern utility area housing the furnace and water heater. Beyond that was the original root cellar, a space carved directly into the Pennsylvania earth, lined with crumbling fieldstone and supported by thick, rotting timber. The air down there was perpetually cold, carrying the metallic scent of old soil and rust. He walked through the damp space, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating forgotten mason jars and decaying wooden crates. At the far end of the cellar, hidden behind a towering stack of rotting wooden pallets, he noticed a shadow that did not align with the stone wall. He pulled the heavy pallets aside, his hands blackening with decades of dust. Behind them was a narrow alcove, and set deeply into the stone of that alcove was a door. It was not a normal basement door. It was constructed of solid, thick oak, reinforced with heavy strips of blackened iron. There was no doorknob. Instead, a massive iron hasp was bolted to the wood, secured by a rusted padlock the size of a man's fist. More disturbing than the lock was the thick industrial chain wrapped tightly around the hinges and the hasp, effectively binding the door to the stone frame. The chain was severely rusted, suggesting it had not been moved in 50 years or more. The husband stood in the cold, staring at the barricade. The door bowed slightly outward, as if warped by time or pressure. He stepped closer, raising his hand to touch the rusted metal of the lock. Before his fingers could make contact, he felt a vibration traveling through the stone floor and into the soles of his boots. He froze. From the other side of the heavy oak, mere inches from his face, came the distinct, unmistakable sound of something shifting its weight. It was a slow, deliberate scrape of something heavy and organic moving against the wood. He backed away slowly, his breath misting in the cold cellar air. He did not turn his back on the door until he had retreated to the wooden stairs. When he returned to the main floor, he locked the cellar door behind him and told his wife about the chained room. They agreed not to force the padlock. They rationalized that the previous owners had sealed the room for structural reasons, perhaps to prevent a collapse or to block off a damp, unventilated space. They tried to convince themselves that the sounds were simply acoustic anomalies trapped in a hollow chamber, but the fear had already taken root. The following week, the wife was sorting through debris in the unfinished attic, looking for old architectural plans that might explain the layout of the foundation. Tucked away beneath a loose floorboard near the chimney brickwork, she found a small, tarnished tin box. Inside were several dried, brittle documents and a stack of black and white photographs. The edges of the photos were curled and yellowed with age. Written in faded black ink on the back of the topmost picture was the year 1924. She brought the photographs down to the kitchen table, wiping the dust from their surfaces. The first few images were mundane. Landscapes of the farm before the trees had grown tall, a picture of a horse-drawn wagon, a stern-looking family standing rigidly on the front porch. But the final 3 photographs made her blood run cold. The pictures showed the basement. Specifically, they showed the heavy oak door. However, in the photographs, the door was wide open, revealing the room beyond. The flash of the old camera illuminated a small, windowless chamber constructed of thick, rough-hewn stone. There was no furniture in the room save for a single heavy wooden chair positioned facing the furthest corner. But it was the walls that commanded attention. The stone surfaces were covered in deep, erratic grooves. They were frantic, overlapping scratches that traveled from the floor all the way up to the low ceiling, as if something desperate had tried to claw its way through solid rock. The final photograph was the most unsettling. It was taken from inside the small chamber, looking out toward the open doorway. The heavy iron door was visible, and the massive padlock hung open. But the camera flash illuminated the inside of the door itself. The thick oak was heavily gouged, splintered, and stained with dark, irregular patches. Whatever had been in that room had not been protecting itself from the outside, it had been trapped inside. And according to the state of the door in the photograph, it had spent years trying to get out. The family did not sleep that night. They sat together in the living room, the tin box resting on the coffee table. Outside, a light snow began to fall, blanketing the isolated farm in a deep, smothering quiet. Inside, the house felt entirely different. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a vessel sitting on top of a cage. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, the noises began again. This time, they were not subtle. The deep, heavy thudding started directly beneath the living room floor. It was louder than it had ever been, vibrating through the floorboards with enough force to rattle the glass in the window frames. The husband and wife sat paralyzed on the sofa, clutching each other as the rhythmic dragging paced furiously back and forth beneath them. Then, the dragging stopped. A new sound echoed up through the heating grates. It was the sharp, metallic clinking of a heavy chain being pulled taut. Someone, or something, was standing on the other side of that basement door. The family listened in absolute horror as the rusted iron chain groaned under immense pressure. The sound was impossible. The chain was wrapped on the outside of the door, secured by the padlock. Yet, the horrific squeal of stressed metal suggested that tremendous force was being applied from the inside, pushing the heavy oak door outward, stretching the rusted links to their breaking point. The husband stood up, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the door leading down to the cellar. He took a hesitant step forward. His wife grabbed his arm, shaking her head violently, her eyes wide with terror. But a strange compulsion seemed to guide him. He walked to the cellar door and pressed his ear against the painted wood. From the depths of the basement, beneath the groan of the straining iron, he heard a sound that would haunt his reports to investigators for years to come. It was not a roar, and it was not a cry. It was the wet, ragged sound of breathing. It was heavy, labored, and unnaturally loud, echoing through the hollow space of the cellar like a bellows drawing in the cold, damp air. And layered beneath that breathing was the frantic, continuous sound of fingernails tearing into hard oak. Suddenly, the house fell completely silent. The pressure on the chain released with a sharp metallic clank. The scratching stopped, the heavy breathing faded into the ambient hum of the winter wind outside. The silence that followed was suffocating. Worse than the noise had been, it was the silence of something waiting. They did not wait for the sun to rise. The family gathered their coats, woke their sleeping daughter, and walked out into the freezing night. They climbed into their vehicle and drove away down the dark gravel road, leaving the lights on and the front door unlocked. They never spent another night in the farmhouse. When they eventually returned a month later with a local contractor and a law enforcement officer to retrieve their belongings, the house was just as they had left it. The winter air had chilled the interior to freezing temperatures. The officer, listening to their frantic story, agreed to inspect the basement. He descended the stairs with a heavy flashlight, hand resting cautiously on his service weapon. He found the hidden alcove exactly as the husband had described. He found the heavy oak door, he found the massive iron padlock, but the heavy industrial chain, the rusted metal that had bound the door closed for decades, lay entirely severed on the dirt floor. The thick steel links had not been cut with a tool, they had been stretched and snapped, twisted apart by a force that defied explanation. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, resting open by about 3 inches. The officer slowly pushed the door wide. The chamber inside was empty. There was no wooden chair, as seen in the 1920s photographs. There were only the stone walls, covered from floor to ceiling in deep, ancient scratches. And yet, the air inside the small room was strangely warm, carrying a thick copper scent that made the officer feel immediately nauseous. The family sold the property at a massive loss a few months later to an out-of-state developer. The farmhouse was eventually demolished, the stone foundation collapsed and filled in with heavy machinery. Today, the land is nothing more than a sprawling field of overgrown weeds and wild brush. But local legends persist among the people who live out on those dark country roads. They say that if you walk out into that specific field on a quiet winter night, long after midnight, you can still hear the rhythmic sound of something heavy dragging itself across the frozen Pennsylvania clay. The silence at Cold Creek Tower. Deep in the remote stretches of the Cascade Mountains, there are places where the tree canopy grows so thick that the forest floor never sees the sun. Above this dark ocean of pine and fir, suspended on wooden legs 70 feet in the air, sits the Cold Creek Fire Lookout. It is a fragile glass box in the sky built to watch over hundreds of miles of unbroken wilderness. For most of its history, it was a place of quiet solitude, a sanctuary for those who preferred the company of the wind over the noise of the world. But according to local forestry legends, the tower has stood completely abandoned since the late summer of 1974, left to rot in the damp mountain air because of what happened to the last man who lived inside it. His name, according to the old ranger logs, was Thomas. He was a veteran of the wilderness, a quiet man in his early 50s who had spent over a decade working solitary seasons in various watchtowers across the Pacific Northwest. The job of a fire lookout requires a specific type of mind. For 3 months at a time, there is no human contact, there are no visitors. There is only the sweeping view of the horizon, the shifting weather patterns, and the endless, crushing silence of the mountains. Thomas was used to this rhythm. He arrived at Cold Creek in early June, carrying a radio, a few books, and enough canned provisions to last until the first snow of November. For the first 2 months, his daily reports to the main ranger station in the valley were completely routine. He called in at 8 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening, reporting humidity levels, wind direction, and lightning strikes. His voice over the radio was always calm, steady, and professional. But as August approached, the atmosphere in the mountains began to change. A thick, unseasonable fog settled into the valleys, refusing to burn off during the day. The air grew heavy and unnaturally still. Birds stopped calling from the canopy below. It was during this period of oppressive weather that the radio operators at the base station noticed a subtle shift in Thomas and his transmissions. He began calling in outside of his scheduled times. At first, the calls were brief and pertained to minor details, a strange shadow he saw moving along the distant ridge, or a patch of dead trees he had not noticed before. But soon, the reports became less about the forest and more about the immediate area surrounding the base of his tower. On the evening of August 14th, at approximately 9:30 p.m., Thomas broke radio silence to ask if any hikers had registered for permits in the Cold Creek sector. The operator informed him that the sector was closed due to the fog and poor trail conditions. No one was out there. Thomas paused for a long time before replying that he had seen a flashlight beam moving slowly through the trees about 200 yards east of his position. The operator, assuming it was a lost hunter, told Thomas to keep his searchlight off and remain in the cabin until morning. Thomas agreed, but his voice sounded tense. He mentioned that the light did not look like a standard flashlight. It was too pale, and it did not bounce or sway like it was being carried by someone walking. It simply glided through the timber low to the ground before winking out in the thick mist. 3 days later, the situation escalated. It was just past midnight when the base station radio crackled to life. Thomas was speaking in a hushed, strained whisper, as if he were afraid of being overheard. He reported that someone or something was standing at the edge of the tree line just beyond the reach of the moonlight. The radio operator asked if he could see a face or clothing. Thomas replied that it was too dark, but he could see a tall, misshapen silhouette. It had been standing absolutely motionless for over an hour, facing the tower. The operator suggested sending a patrol up the mountain at first light. Thomas agreed, but before he signed off, he muttered something that sent a chill through the dispatch room. He said the shape had not arrived by walking out of the woods. He said he had been watching the tree line, and the shadow had simply materialized from the fog, as if it had seeped up from the damp earth itself. The patrol that hiked up the next morning found nothing. The ground around the tower was undisturbed. There were no boot prints in the mud, no broken branches, and no signs of a camp. The rangers spent 2 hours checking the perimeter before hiking back down, writing the incident off as a trick of the fog, and the severe isolation taking its toll on the lookout. They advised Thomas to take a few days off and come down to the valley, but he refused. He insisted that he was fine and that the tower was his responsibility. That decision would become the focal point of a legend that has haunted the Regional Forestry Service for decades. The final radio transmission from Cold Creek Tower occurred on the night of August 21st. It began at exactly 3:15 in the morning. The operator on duty was half asleep when the console burst into a loud, hissing static. Through the heavy interference, Thomas spoke. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was frantic, breathless, and stripped of all professionalism. He did not use his call sign. He simply said it was at the bottom of the stairs. The operator, now fully awake, asked him to repeat the message. Thomas ignored the request. The microphone on his end was keyed open, broadcasting the ambient sound of the glass cabin into the dispatch room. The operator could hear Thomas breathing heavily, the sound of the wind rattling the window panes, and then something else. According to the official transcripts and the memories of the operator, a rhythmic, heavy sound began to echo through the radio. It was the distinct noise of weight being placed on wooden planks. Footsteps, but they were wrong. They were far too slow and far too heavy for a human being. The Cold Creek Tower had exactly 60 wooden steps winding up its metal frame. The operator listened in frozen horror as the slow, agonizingly deliberate footsteps climbed higher and higher. A heavy thump, a long pause, another heavy thump, another pause. The old wood groaned in protest under a massive weight. Through the radio, Thomas began to pray softly. He did not ask for help, knowing the nearest station was hours away. He simply backed himself into the furthest corner of the cabin. The footsteps reached the landing just outside the heavy wooden trapdoor that led into the room. For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and Thomas taking ragged breaths. Then a sharp, metallic screech tore through the static. It was the sound of the heavy iron latch on the trapdoor being slowly turned from the outside. A latch that could only be reached by someone standing on the final step. Thomas let out a single, sharp intake of air, and then the radio went completely dead. The connection was severed, leaving nothing but an empty hiss filling the dispatch room. The operator called out frantically for the next hour, but no response ever came from the dark mountains. By sunrise, a full search and rescue team was navigating the steep, treacherous trail up to Cold Creek. They arrived at the clearing just before noon. The tower stood exactly as it always had, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. But when the rangers climbed the 60 steps and pushed open the trapdoor, they found the glass cabin completely empty. Thomas was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, the windows were intact, the furniture was upright, and a cup of coffee was sitting cold on the desk. The radio was still switched on, the microphone resting on the floor, his boots, his jacket, and his emergency flare gun were all still hanging on their hooks. The only strange detail the search party noted was a foul, stagnant odor lingering in the cabin, smelling strongly of wet soil and ozone, and deep scratch marks etched into the thick wood of the trapdoor on the inside of the cabin. Despite weeks of searching the surrounding valleys and ravines with dogs and helicopters, not a single trace of Thomas was ever found. The Forestry Service officially classified it as a case of severe psychological break, suggesting he had wandered off into the woods in a state of delusion and succumbed to the elements. The tower was locked, boarded up, and eventually decommissioned. But the legend of Cold Creek did not end with the official report. Over the next 30 years, hikers and rogue campers who ventured too close to the abandoned structure began to return with deeply unsettling stories. Those who have camped in the shadow of the tall, rusting legs report waking up in the dead of night to a sudden, absolute drop in temperature. They speak of the forest going completely silent, the crickets and the wind simply stopping. And then, in the suffocating quiet, they hear it. The slow, heavy creak of the lowest wooden step bending under an immense, unseen weight. The sound of wet, heavy footsteps beginning a slow ascent toward the empty glass box in the sky. Few people ever stay long enough to hear if the footsteps reach the top, but those who do claim that when the sun finally rises, the old iron latch on the trapdoor is always found unhooked, swinging gently in the cold mountain air. The room behind the wallpaper. There is a specific kind of silence that belongs only to abandoned houses. It is not an empty silence, but a heavy, waiting one. In the rural stretches of the American Midwest, where old farmhouses sit isolated amidst miles of flat, dormant fields, this silence can become absolute. According to local lore and a series of disturbing public reports from the early 2000s, one such house stood at the end of a long, overgrown dirt road in central Indiana. It had been built in 1914, a tall, narrow structure with steep gables and a wraparound porch that had slowly rotted into the damp soil. For nearly 17 years, the property had sat completely vacant. The previous owners had simply packed their belongings and left without a word to their scattered neighbors, allowing the bank to eventually reclaim the lonely property. The house sat locked, dark, and perfectly still, slowly surrendering to the elements. In the spring of 2015, the property was purchased at a county auction by a man named Elias. He was looking for a quiet restoration project, a place far removed from the noise of the city where he could work with his hands. When he first turned the heavy brass key in the front door, the air that met him was stale and thick, smelling of old pine, dry rot, and generations of trapped dust. The house was structurally sound, but the interior was a time capsule of neglect. Peeling paint hung from the ceilings like dead skin, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. Elias decided to live in the house while he worked, setting up a simple cot and a camping stove in the downstairs living room. He spent his first week clearing away debris and opening windows to let the spring breeze chase away the stagnant air. The isolation was total. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away, and at night, the only sounds were the wind moving through the tall grass and the deep, settling bones of the old house. The master bedroom was located on the second floor, at the end of a long, narrow hallway. It was a large room, but it felt oddly claustrophobic. The walls were covered in a thick, dark, floral wallpaper that looked to have been hung sometime in the 1970s. The pattern was a dizzying repetition of brown and dull orange roses, faded by time and stained with water damage near the ceiling. Elias decided this room would be his first major undertaking. He planned to strip the walls down to the original plaster, repair the cracks, and bring light back into the space. He carried his tools upstairs on a quiet Tuesday morning, a spray bottle of solvent, a wide metal putty knife, and a heavy trash bag. He began in the corner nearest the window, scoring the thick paper and letting the chemicals soak into the ancient glue. The work was slow and hypnotic. Scrape, peel, drop. Scrape, peel, drop. The rhythmic sound of the metal blade against the plaster filled the quiet room. As the day wore on, Elias found himself slipping into a trance, his mind emptying as he methodically removed decades of ugly history from the walls. But as he moved along the longest wall of the bedroom, the one that supposedly backed against the exterior of the house, he noticed something strange. The geometry of the room felt slightly wrong. He stopped and looked around, trying to pinpoint the source of his unease. The bedroom was rectangular, but the wall he was currently stripping seemed too thick. Based on the windows outside, there should have been more space between this room and the edge of the roofline. He brushed the thought away, attributing it to the quirky architecture of early 20th century farmhouses, and went back to his scraping. That night, Elias lay on his cot in the living room, listening to the house. Old houses always make noise at night, expanding and contracting with the drop in temperature. But around 2:30 in the morning, he heard a sound that did not fit the usual symphony of settling wood. It was a soft, muffled shifting coming from directly above him. From the master bedroom, it sounded like the deliberate slide of fabric across a wooden floor. He lay perfectly still, holding his breath, his eyes fixed on the dark ceiling. The sound came again, followed by a faint, rhythmic creaking. It was a slow, measured sound, like someone shifting their weight. Elias convinced himself it was a raccoon or a stray cat that had found its way into the attic, though he had found no holes in the roof. Eventually, the house fell completely silent again, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next day, Elias returned to the master bedroom. The air in the room felt different today. It was heavier, and despite the open window, there was a faint, sour smell hanging in the space, something like old copper and unwashed clothes. He ignored it, focusing on the wall. The wallpaper here was particularly stubborn, applied in multiple layers over the years. As he drove his putty knife beneath a thick seam, the blade caught on something hard. He pushed harder, and a large chunk of plaster flaked away, revealing a vertical strip of dark, rough-hewn wood. He frowned, running his hand over the exposed grain. It was the edge of a door frame. Curiosity taking over, Elias began to work faster, tearing away large strips of the floral paper with his bare hands. Dust plumed into the air, catching in the pale sunlight. Beneath the layers of paper and plaster, a shape emerged. It was a narrow, rectangular door, seamlessly built into the wall and plastered over decades ago. There was no doorknob, no visible hinges. It had been designed to disappear completely. Elias stood back, his heart beating a little faster in his chest. According to the original blueprints he had studied, there was nothing behind this wall but the exterior siding. Yet here was a door. He went downstairs and retrieved a heavy iron crowbar from his toolbox. When he returned to the bedroom, the silence felt expectant. He wedged the flat end of the crowbar into the hairline crack between the door and the frame. He threw his weight against the iron bar. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud, shrieking crack of old wood and rusted nails, the door gave way. It popped outward, sending a shower of dry plaster dust cascading onto the floorboards. Elias pulled the door open. He expected the smell of a tomb. He expected the dry, choking scent of dead air, mouse droppings, and ancient dust. Instead, the draft that hit his face was shockingly warm. Elias raised his flashlight and pointed the beam into the darkness. Beyond the door was a narrow, hidden corridor, barely 3 feet wide, running the entire length of the bedroom wall. It was a void space, a blind spot in the architecture. But it was not empty. The beam of light swept over the floor and stopped. Elias felt the blood drain from his face, a cold numbness spreading down his arms. There was no dust on the floorboards. The space had been swept clean. Lying in the center of the narrow room was a dark green sleeping bag. Beside it sat a plastic gallon jug of water, still half full, with condensation clinging to the inside of the plastic. Next to the water was a crumpled fast food wrapper, its bright yellow logo clear and entirely modern, alongside a local newspaper dated exactly 4 days ago. Elias could not move. His mind violently rejected what his eyes were showing him. The house had been locked. He was miles from anyone. Yet here, hidden behind a sealed wall in a house abandoned for 17 years, was a space that someone was living in right now. He took a slow, trembling step into the hidden room, the floorboards groaning softly beneath his boots. The sour smell he had noticed earlier was overwhelmingly strong in here. It was the smell of a confined human body, the smell of someone hiding. He directed the flashlight beam to the back wall of the narrow space, the wall that backed up to the master bedroom. There, spaced out at eye level, were 3 small, perfectly round holes drilled completely through the wood and the plaster. Elias leaned in, shining his light near one of the holes. He looked through it. The view offered a perfect, unobstructed line of sight into the master bedroom. The hole was angled downward, focusing directly on the spot where Elias had been standing for the past 2 days, stripping the wallpaper. Whoever lived in this wall had been standing in the dark, less than 2 feet away from him, watching him work, watching him breathe, listening to the scrape of his putty knife. Panic finally broke through his paralysis. He spun around, his flashlight beam swinging wildly through the dark space. He realized the hidden corridor extended further toward the back of the house, leading toward the chimney breast. He moved toward it, his breathing shallow and rapid. As he passed the sleeping bag, he noticed something that made his stomach turn completely over. The top flap of the sleeping bag was folded back, and the fabric was crushed. Without thinking, Elias reached down and placed his bare hand against the green material. It was warm. Whoever was staying in the walls had not left days ago. They had not left hours ago. They had been in the sleeping bag when Elias first began prying at the door with his crowbar. They had listened to him breaking through the wood, and they had quietly slipped out the back of the hidden tunnel just moments before he opened it. Elias backed out of the room, his chest tight with terror. He stumbled into the master bedroom, dropping the crowbar with a heavy clatter. He did not bother to gather his tools. He did not stop to pack his cot or his camping stove in the living room below. He ran down the stairs, his boots thundering in the terrible silence of the house, threw open the front door, and sprinted to his truck. He locked the doors, his hands shaking violently as he fumbled with the keys in the ignition, and drove down the overgrown dirt road without looking back. According to later reports, the local county sheriff arrived at the property an hour later. 2 deputies drew their weapons and searched the entire house, clearing every room. When they reached the master bedroom, they found the open door in the wall. They found the sleeping bag, the fresh water, and the peepholes. But the occupant was gone. A thorough investigation of the hidden corridor revealed a secondary panel near the chimney that opened into a dark shaft leading all the way down to the dirt floor of the basement, where a small window had been quietly unlatched from the inside. The authorities never identified who had been living in the walls of the old farmhouse. They could not determine how long the person had been there, or how they had known to claim the empty house as their own. Some investigators suspected it was simply a drifter, someone passing through who had found a clever place to hide from the elements. But local residents whispered other theories, wondering about the kind of person who chooses to live in total darkness, breathing the dust of a dead house just to watch a stranger from behind the wallpaper. Elias never returned to the property. He sold it back to the bank at a heavy loss, forever haunted by the memory of the warm fabric and the sickening realization of how quietly we can be watched in the dark. They found a tunnel under the school. Deep beneath the polished hardwood floors and brightly lit corridors of the old primary school, there was a heavy iron door that no one had opened in at least 40 years. It sat at the very back of the subterranean boiler room, half hidden behind rusted water pipes and mounds of forgotten maintenance supplies. The metal was cold to the touch, oxidized into a deep shade of burnt orange, and secured by a heavy brass padlock that had fused together with age and dampness. For generations of students and staff, the door was simply a fixture of the basement, an architectural dead end that blended into the permanent shadows. But according to local legend, the older buildings in the district were connected by a hidden network of steam tunnels built in the early 20th century and long since abandoned. No one knew for sure where the iron door led until the summer of 1998, when a private crew of contractors was hired to gut the basement. The school was completely empty. It was the middle of July, and the stifling, oppressive heat of the season pressed down on the brick exterior of the building. But down in the boiler room, the air was perpetually damp and uncomfortably cold. A crew of 3 men had been tasked with removing the outdated insulation and tearing out the ancient plumbing. Their work was slow, methodical, and accompanied only by the dull, droning hum of their portable work lights. The basement was a sprawling maze of concrete rooms, smelling faintly of heating oil, wet dust, and decay. On the morning of the 4th day, just past 10 o'clock, the foreman directed his team to clear the far wall. They hauled away decades of accumulated junk. There were broken wooden chairs, stacks of water-damaged textbooks, and heavy rolls of rotting canvas. When the iron door was finally exposed in its entirety, it seemed to absorb the light from their halogen lamps. The foreman, consulting the faded, brittle blueprints of the 1924 foundation, noticed that the space behind the wall was simply marked as solid earth. There was no door on the schematic. Driven by mild curiosity and the professional need to ensure no active pipes ran behind the wall, the foreman retrieved a pair of heavy bolt cutters from his truck. The brass padlock snapped with a sharp, echoing crack that rang violently through the quiet basement. The hinges shrieked in protest as the heavy iron was pulled outward, shedding thick flakes of rust onto the concrete floor. Beyond the threshold, there was no solid earth and no forgotten storage closet. Instead, the pale beams of their heavy flashlights revealed a narrow, arched tunnel made of dark, weeping brick. The tunnel stretched straight ahead, descending at a slight angle, disappearing into absolute blackness. A wave of stagnant, freezing air rolled out of the opening. It carried with it the unmistakable scent of wet earth, dry rot, and something else. It was something faintly metallic and sour, like unwashed skin and stale breath. The workers stood in total silence, shining their lights deep into the abyss. The air inside the tunnel felt incredibly heavy, as if the space itself resented the sudden intrusion of light. According to the men who were there that day, the silence emanating from the passage was profound, somehow swallowing the ambient noise of the boiler room entirely. Armed with heavy, military-grade flashlights, the foreman and the youngest of his workers stepped over the iron threshold. Their heavy work boots crunched softly on a thick layer of gray, powdery dust that coated the floor. The ceiling was low, forcing the men to stoop slightly as they walked. The brick walls were slick with thick condensation, and long, pale roots from the ancient oak trees above had pushed their way through the crumbling mortar, hanging like lifeless fingers from the ceiling. They walked for what felt like 200 feet, their lights sweeping back and forth, cutting through the dense, floating particles of dust that danced in the beams. The descent felt endless. The ambient temperature continued to drop with every step, chilling the sweat on the backs of their necks. It was the younger worker who noticed the first terrifying anomaly. He aimed his beam down at the floor, pausing his stride and holding his breath. The thick layer of dust beneath them was not undisturbed. Running right down the center of the tunnel, Alongside their own fresh, heavy boot prints was a faint but distinct trail. Someone had walked through this passage recently. But the prints were not made by boots or modern shoes. They were the distinct, unmistakable impressions of bare feet. The toes were elongated, the arches pressed flat, the skin seemingly grinding deep into the grime with deliberate, heavy steps. The tracks overlapped in places, heading both deeper into the tunnel and back toward the iron door, indicating a routine, repeated journey spanning years. The men stopped moving. The quiet of the tunnel seemed to close in around them, thick and suffocating. They listened, straining their ears against the dark, but there was only the slow, rhythmic dripping of water from somewhere far ahead. They continued forward, moving much slower now, the initial curiosity souring into a cold, creeping dread that settled in their stomachs. The tunnel began to widen, the arched ceiling opening up into a larger, cavernous space that sat directly beneath the center of the school, likely positioned right under the main auditorium. The beams of their flashlights hit a barrier. It was a makeshift wall, constructed from warped wooden pallets, rusted chain-link fencing, and sheets of corrugated tin scavenged from unknown places. A heavy curtain made of sewn-together burlap sacks hung over a narrow gap in the center, acting as a crude doorway. The air here smelled intensely of old paper, damp cloth, and the undeniable sickening tang of human habitation. The foreman slowly reached out, his hand trembling slightly, using the heavy metal casing of his flashlight to push the burlap aside. What they saw inside the enclosure would haunt the men for the rest of their natural lives. It was not a temporary shelter, it was an established home. The subterranean room was meticulously organized, lit entirely by the harsh, sweeping beams of the workers' lights. In the far corner sat a makeshift bed constructed from 4 old wooden school desks bolted together and topped with a rotting gymnasium mat. Blankets made from discarded winter coats were neatly folded at the foot. A battered metal filing cabinet served as a pantry, its drawers filled with dozens of canned goods. Some of the cans bore faded labels dating back to the late 1970s, while others were freshly bought, their bright modern wrappers contrasting sickeningly with the decay around them. There was a small, battery-powered lantern, a plastic bucket of gray water, and a single, cracked mirror leaning against the brick. But the most disturbing element of the room, the detail that made the workers feel physically ill, was the walls. Every square inch of the brickwork had been plastered with pages torn from old textbooks, library volumes, and school directories. They were held in place by a thick, dark paste that smelled vaguely of iron and rot. And on every single page, written in tight, obsessive, microscopic handwriting, were detailed logs. The foreman stepped closer, leaning in and shining his light directly on the black ink. The writing detailed the daily routines of the school above. There were endless columns noting the exact times the morning bell rang, down to the very second. There were lists detailing the sound of specific footsteps in the hallway overhead, categorized by weight and pace. There were names of teachers, names of janitors, and deeply unsettling descriptions of private conversations overheard through the ventilation shafts. Whoever lived here had spent years, perhaps decades, sitting in the damp dark, listening to the life of the school, moving above them, recording every mundane detail with a patient, terrifying dedication. On a small wooden crate functioning as a bedside table, they found a collection of objects arranged like a shrine. There were dozens of small, seemingly insignificant items that had undoubtedly been lost by the children above over the years. A plastic hair clip, a broken yellow pencil, a single silver earring, a faded spelling test graded with red ink. These items had been meticulously cleaned and arranged in perfect, symmetrical circles. It was undeniable evidence that the inhabitant did not just stay in the tunnel. In the dead of night, when the building was locked and empty, they had been leaving their subterranean nest, walking the silent halls of the school, collecting discarded pieces of the world they were obsessed with, before retreating back into the earth before sunrise. In the exact center of the room sat a single wooden chair. It was positioned directly beneath a heavy iron grate set into the ceiling. The younger worker aimed his flashlight upward, illuminating the vertical shaft above the grate. It led straight up to a secondary floor vent, one that they knew belonged to the kindergarten classroom. A thick, icy knot formed in the foreman's stomach. Beside the chair was a small radio, entirely disassembled. Its delicate wires had been spliced and run up the wall, tapped directly into the school's public address system. The inhabitant of the tunnel had not just been listening through the floorboards, they had been wired into every single room in the building, capable of hearing every morning announcement, every lecture, every scolding, and every quiet whisper captured by an open intercom button. The workers stood paralyzed, the absolute wrongness of the space sinking deep into their bones. The realization that hundreds of children had played, teachers had taught, and administrators had worked for years, while a nameless, faceless observer existed beneath their feet, was a suffocating weight. The air felt utterly breathless. Then, from the absolute blackness of the tunnel extending past the living quarters, they heard it. It was a very soft, deliberate sound, the subtle, wet scrape of a bare heel dragging across loose stone. The sound was incredibly close, perhaps no more than 30 feet away in the pitch blackness. The beam of the younger worker's flashlight trembled violently, illuminating the floating dust, but hitting nothing but deep, shifting shadows. Another scrape echoed through the tunnel. Then, a slow, rattling exhalation of breath that bounced off the damp bricks. They did not wait to see what was standing in the dark. The men turned and ran. They abandoned their heavy tools, their boots slamming against the floor of the tunnel, kicking up massive clouds of gray dust that choked their lungs. The darkness seemed to chase them, the oppressive silence of the tunnel suddenly replaced by the frantic echoing of their own panicked flight. They scrambled up the slight incline, their beams bouncing wildly off the arched ceiling. They burst through the iron door into the relative safety of the boiler room, the foreman slamming the heavy metal shut behind them with a deafening crash. He grabbed a heavy length of industrial chain from the floor and wrapped it around the handle, securing it with a spare lock from his tool belt. They stood in the bright, artificial light of the basement, gasping for air, staring intensely at the rusted door, half expecting the handle to slowly turn. The local police were called later that afternoon. Several officers descended into the basement, armed and incredibly cautious, and cut the chain. They navigated the long, dusty tunnel and found the subterranean room exactly as the terrified workers had described. But the space was completely empty. The occupant was gone. Further exploration by investigators revealed that the tunnel continued for another mile, eventually emptying out into an overgrown, abandoned storm drain near the edge of the county line. The police collected the massive stacks of journals, the rusted cans, and the spliced radio parts, hauling them out in sealed plastic evidence bags. The contents of those pages were never released to the public, though quiet rumors persisted among local law enforcement that the meticulous handwriting matched a former night custodian who had vanished without a trace in the late 1960s. The school district acted quickly and quietly to bury the incident. Within a week, a specialized construction crew was brought in during the dead of night to pour tons of solid concrete behind the iron door, sealing the tunnel forever. The official story provided to the town and the parents was a vague statement about addressing minor structural instabilities in the ancient foundation. The workers were paid generously and moved on to other jobs in different towns. But those who stood in that underground room never truly shook the memory. They spoke in hushed tones of the damp smell, the meticulous handwriting, and the terrifying patience of a life lived entirely in the dark. The school still stands today, bustling with life and the joyful sounds of children. But sometimes, when the building is quiet and the bitter winter winds howl around the old brick exterior, teachers working late insist they can hear a faint, rhythmic scratching coming from deep within the walls, as if someone is still down there, listening and waiting.